we do already put in place and have in the past put in place talking about styles that were appropriate and not appropriate. And so we are already doing that job and have been doing it for a long time. So continuing that would be appropriate. I hope everybody will consider that. Thank you.
So again, we're still on the, thank you, David, on the public comments on non-agenda items. It's true this is really non-agenda in the sense that we went through it. Hold on one second. I just want to, before we get to the steering committee, I just want to keep it open to the public, if you don't mind. Don, can you hold your comment for 1 second?
I have a public thing, not mine.
Okay, hold on. All right, here we go.
I had a call from Carolyn Walker-Davis, who wasn't able to join us either way, in person or on Zoom, and she asked me if I could express some concerns she had, and then I was going to do that, and then she sent me a note, basically those comments, which I will read. I've attached quick snapshots I took on my morning walk yesterday to illustrate the importance of allowing and encouraging more building materials for fences and gates. The currently sanctioned grape stakes and/or wood fencing and gates. There you go. Thank you. Seem to be taking over and stifling creativity, although perfectly appropriate for some sites. In recent years, many new, shiny, solid, quote, massive grape stake fences have appeared in strange places. She's talking about ones that have no spacing, that are just solid grape stakes, having no reference to the newly designed building. Stone and ironwork, masonry, and low stucco, well-designed walls, fences, gates should be allowed and encouraged, if appropriate, to the design of the building. Of the attached photos taken as an afterthought on the walk, the one that looks the worst is the wood fence, currently encouraged by the guidelines. A bit of stone out front would have made a much more cohesively designed building site composition. She goes on to talk about Francis Whitaker's comments, who did the wonderful iron gates. I'll pass around these photos so you'll see what she's talking about. And that's her comments.
Okay, so to just for people who might not have heard, we have a public comment from somebody who couldn't be here today, Carolyn Walker-Davis, who's talking about the problem with bad wood fences, and that if we encourage wood fences sort of exclusively and they turn out bad, then they're worse than something that might have more diverse materials. And I guess this is the example here. It must be in her mind, right? So these is a solid wood fence. That's what she's saying? So she's on the bottom here. She's saying that is not as open and appropriate as something that would be more solid. I mean, different material, but more open. So it's more porous. So she's advocating for porosity and not so much strictness on materials if it means that we don't have porosity, it sounds like. Pass that around. Okay. Thank you for bringing that to us, Don. Any other public comments on items not on today's topic list?
Sorry, I'm late and can't stay too long. I just had sort of a general thought, is that I'm trying to find some peace in our struggle here, in our conflict between what I think is primarily the architectural profession and the people of Carmel. And that now that I see it, it is largely this in this kind of a context. Obviously, there are people in Carmel who want modern, understood. We've talked about that. The percentage is not very high. Is that what by the way, you guys have spent a lot of time studying architectural psychology. I did a 3-part seminar that was given at Sonoma State University on the psychology of architecture. When a people has a feeling about their place, that they identify with because of their history, because they were born there, because of where they came from, because of and they have a sense of what works and does not work in their city. You do not let the architects override that and say, you're wrong and we're right. You listen to the people, and now what the architects do is say, let's work with the residents. What are the residents? They don't want modern style in Carmel. Okay, we got it. Let's just go there and let's be done with it and let's serve them. We'll do our other work in modern, which will get us our reputation and so on elsewhere. You know, we don't have to do that in Carmel. And serve the people. Architecture to me is a profession of service. So I just wanted to say that and try and make it more understandable that we're not trying to create a fight or we're not hating architects or anything like that. We're just saying, can we please acknowledge the will of the residents like that sign up there says? And that's all for now.
Is it, related to what Neil said? I'm going to bring it back to the committee if we can finish is that okay? I just want to make sure we've got all the public comment out. Is there anything on any other topic that's not? Oh, is anybody in the Zoom room on this issue? I don't see anybody. Anyone on the public that has something unrelated to the style but also not on the topic list? Okay. All right. So let's close that public comment part, and now bringing it back to the committee. Sounds like you want to. No, you want to go to David first? David already. Oh, did you have your hand up again?
No. Are you done?
Yes, I'm finished. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say something related to what Neil was saying. I found it very interesting. I was looking for something on the internet relative to the city. And so I looked at city promotion. It's very interesting what they have. They have all the storybook things. That's what the city uses to promote us. And so I just bring that up, that it's a little bit amazing when we spend so much time talking about style to see how our city projects itself anyway to tourism. So I say that. And I think that Carolyn Walker Davis's issue is pretty much resolved by us, because we say we want to be able to look through fences and be able to see the landscaping and the open space, et cetera. So I think that that we got her message loud and clear some months ago, and we all support that. So I hope that you'll let her know, Don, if she's not on Zoom land, I can't see, but let her know that that we acknowledge what she's saying.
I'm sure she'll tune in.
Okay, good.
Later.
Anybody else?
Well, I'm a little confused about when we can talk about unrelated issues.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure the public had all their comments out so we can move to the next agenda item. So now we're on announcements for the steering committee and the staff. Do you have any announcements, Brandon? Okay. So do you have something you want to say?
It's not an announcement, so it belongs into the comments that are not related on the agenda. I just wanted to react to a couple things from the last meeting. Well, first of all, David, I want to really thank you for your comment, because going home from that meeting last week, I was deeply disturbed about the comments. I think that this comment that the people that are others should live somewhere else, I find that is how every society gets radicalized, and it's used for a lot of things. It's not only, next thing the Jews and the blacks don't belong here either, because they really don't fit into our picture, and that's exactly what's used for not doing inclusionary housing, because the Mexicans can live in Seaside. Why would we have to build for them anything in Carmel? And I mean, this is a really awful road, slippery road that we go, this complete intolerance. And I think that's where we need to start. And I find that a deeply, deeply disturbing attitude, and something like architecture that's so harmless. And it's people who live in these houses, who like to live in these houses, has nothing to do with architects. To tell them, like David DiGirolamo or other people that live in these houses that have participated here, to tell them they should leave town. I mean, that's essentially what was said, right? That the people who want modern things should live somewhere else. And that's what I found deeply disturbing. You know, I heard it again today. That was one of the comments. Then I also wanted to react to the landscape ordinance. Thanks for asking about that last week. The city of Seaside has made design a priority and has the funds to hire Jeannie Gang. We are one of the wealthiest communities in California, and we cannot afford to hire the best, even if they live within city limits. I think that's really disappointing. You know, why does the city of Carmel keep not hiring the best and the brightest for the segment of work that we're looking for? And last not least, because reinforcement has come up so much, I was wondering why that fence on Junipero and 8th is still on public property. It actually had fallen down during the storms, and that I drove by a couple days ago, and here it is back up on public property. I don't know why that's not enforced. Why is that fence still there? So that was my
That was near and dear to my
comments.
that gift to me personally. So I've spent 10 frickin' years trying to get that off our property, our public property, my land. So thank you for that. Okay, so I think that we need to get to the discussion items, if we could. You've said you have no announcements, Brandon?
Nope.
Okay. So this is number 5, and again, I appreciate everybody's comments. I don't know if it's resolvable, this thing we're talking about, but I think, you know, it's certainly a fascinating conversation. I don't want to, as the facilitator of the larger conversation, I mean, we really could have days, we could have a whole conference about this, I honestly think, and I don't really think we can, you know, do it every time. So I don't know what else to say as a facilitator of moving this work along, but I do appreciate all the comments, and I think they're serious and they're important. But if you don't mind, let's take up where we left off. I'm just going to check, looking over at the Zoom room. I don't see anything there. We were going from the bottom up for some reason, and we had gotten to the Muni guideline question, but that is a bigger issue still.
Yeah, I think it's different.
Okay, different meeting. So we can skip over the gap and go up one to compounds, street rhythm preservation techniques. Or we don't have to handle these in exactly this order, but has everybody got their list handy? They can see what we're talking about. We did we touch on this? Oh, I guess we started to touch on this, didn't we?
Why did you skip over public spaces?
Oh, no, just because Brandon had hoped that we could go through the entire thing, but we can like, it would take longer, but why not, if you have a comment on it that's, yeah, no, just that it deserves its own pass-through like we did for the other ones.
Yeah, the conversation was possibly taking the municipal version and doing the same treatment we did with the commercial residential as like its own conversation. But I think it would be fruitful possibly to have just a high-level conversation about it.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is from the community and from this group that I have not heard a single person be opposed to the idea of a third volume and separating out these public issues. I mean, this is not a huge group here, but I think I'm just looking around to see if I'm getting any protests about that. I think folks like the idea. We did have this plan to go through it in a more thorough way, separately. I did also want to, I don't have yet, and maybe this would be an update that, you know, as secretary I could do prior to our doing the full through, which is there's only one document that's been integrated into the commercial and residential so far in this draft of the public, which is these, you know, curb designs, and there is a thing about ADA ramps and this is from one city document. So we did want to do some kind of check to determine whether there are other design-related documents floating around in the departments, and just make sure that we coalesce them in one document. That's the sort of promise of this, is that we all can know where to find all that stuff. And also just to elevate it in the community conversation so that the various boards are aware that, this is something that they also need to be focused on when projects come up. So I still don't know if we have that all. Brandon, do you mind commenting on that? And just, I don't know what your suspicions are about wayward documents.
I know they all exist. Yeah, and I think we have most of them pulled together from one of our previous meetings. We did pull together a pile of documents, so I can give it before we have the next meeting to talk about it on its own. I can make sure we pull those together, and we can have those as like a go out like a week ahead of time, pre-materials for everyone to look at.
Cool.
It might be useful if maybe the committee pulls up street standards, public way standards from other communities, and see if the documents we have or the ones that are proposed are void of other issues that should be addressed.
Yeah. I feel a homework assignment coming on to you, Doug. Okay, thank you. Oh, good, thank you. Okay. So we did think we would just not ignore the uppermost G, the potential third, but just, again, save that for when we have a little more information. So I thought we did start to talk, actually last time when the bell rang, about compounds and street rhythm preservation techniques. And Brandon was explaining to us things about how the codes currently encourage some lot merging, and we're trying to at least get to neutral or better on that principle. And
that also, if you apply to demolish, you can't get approved to demolish a house unless you have an approval to build a house back.
Which is what we have right now. Is that's where you want to go. We don't have it quite that.
Exists right now.
I thought you explained that it was you had to have some kind of development plan, but it didn't have to be for a replacement building. Like it could be a pool or a tennis court or a park.
No, that was where I started. And then I remember I did the clarification because I was texting with my staff. They were looking it up for me at the time. So yeah, it is for sure. You have to have a replacement home for the site.
Okay.
Yeah, the issue with the pool one was that they had merged the lot. Right. Okay. So there's still a single family dwelling on that, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you for reminding me. I remember there was that update. And there's, so I think then we went into a conversation about, how to avoid the sort of cookie cutter, the tendency to say, oh, if I have several lots, maybe I'll just do them all at once and with the same builder and the same architect, and it'll just look like a little spec house development, which we have a few of those around. So is there anything else on this topic before we move to up the list? Does anyone have any comments on the compounding and what we discussed last time? People are satisfied with where we got on that? Okay. The possibility of an extent of enclosure. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can you summarize what your understanding is?
Yes, I'll try. My understanding is that some of the things we're afraid of, which could be the radical changing of the rhythm of our 40-foot lots, are possible now because Brandon would like to address the lot merging, the incentives to merge lots that we currently have at the regulatory level. That's not in our purview, but it seems like it's coming along to the point where we are going to not have that encouragement in the regulations. And if that's the case, then the idea that you could design a whole compound that undermines the sort of rhythm of the street would be less possible. But you could still own multiple lots on a nobody can stop. It's a free country. Nobody can stop you from that. So then we were talking about making sure that we have in the next, round, other language to try out that would discourage cookie cutter spec type developments, because that is a temptation. Does that make sense? And then,
So I have a hypothetical, Brandon, and a question. Hypothetical is, what happens if a house burns down?
If a house burns down, then you can apply to rebuild it. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, if you have two adjoining, hypothetical, if you have two adjoining houses or three houses, and consecutive, right, and you'd like to do a compound, but you don't want to rebuild the houses. What if there's a fire? There's no plan on file. There's no demolition that's been permitted. What's the city's response to that? Or there's never an improvement made to the property.
Well, I think, we went down this rabbit hole a little bit last time too. I mean, it's the same response as, so let's take the scenario of someone comes in for a plan to demolish a house and rebuild it. They get the house approved for rebuilding through the planning commission. They pull building permits, they demo the house, and then they just decide never to build a house. That's totally their right to do as a property owner. It's the same thing here. If a house burns down and they choose not to rebuild a house, we can't force someone to build a house back on their property.
Could they put a tennis court there? Or?
No, it's still a residential. So the question was, could they build a tennis court there? And the answer is no. If it's a residentially zoned lot, that's not a use that you can have there.
So then let's imagine there is a corner property at Unipro and 8th. And the owner gets approval for 2 houses, but only builds 1. Don't we potentially have that problem which exists today at that site?
I'm still not sure I understand, because there was just a house that was approved there at the planning commission.
Original approvals were given. Both houses were to be built simultaneously.
But it's not. You can't force someone to build a house. There's no legal requirement that forces someone to build a house. Is that? I mean, that's what you're asking, right? Does the city have a way to force somebody to build a house on a property? And the answer is no.
Conditional use permit for those properties, and they were built simultaneously.
The use permit allows someone to build a house. It doesn't require them to build a house.
Right. But the city went ahead, this is way before all of our time.
Yeah.
The city went ahead and let one house be constructed and not the other house. So it seems like, to me, we ought to have some sort of safeguard so we don't have that situation. And it's just one lot in that situation, but what about multiple lots?
I know so much about this project that we're talking about, and we probably shouldn't spend too much time on it, but that was an enforcement problem. There is no question. That permit was to build an attached to, it's a duplex. And for some reason, it would have been detectable at the very first moment that the shovel hit the ground that this was only going to be half the project. And that's why we've been talking about it for decades since, because it was not done the way it was permitted. It was permitted as a duplex. So I don't know how it gets addressed.
I guess, I mean, probably because I wasn't here at the time, but I still don't fully see the problem, because it's 2 separate pieces of property. Yes, they're under the same ownership, but they have an entitlement to build a property with a house and a property with a development. I mean, were they supposed to be connected to each other?
They are. They was approved as one building.
Across 2, and the lots were supposed to be merged?
It's a commercial property. It had a party wall. It said this permit is only valid if it's built at the same time with the 2 halves of the building.
I'd have to look at it. I mean, I haven't looked at that language, but yeah, I mean, yeah, Marianne, I feel like we're trying to solve for the 1% situation here, honestly, but.
Let's just start with the small things that are doable. Have your public works department remove that fence, and then we worry about the building later. That would be one small step towards a good result.
It is defying logic that we are where we are on that corner. That is for sure. Okay.
It's going to hearing next month at City Council.
Yeah.
Oh, it is?
Yes, it is.
Oh, good. Is that
He's saying that with a light tone, so it makes me think that he's optimistic, but I don't know.
I don't place bets. I don't. If I had a crystal ball that told me how hearings would happen, I would not work here anymore. I'd make $1 million as a consultant.
Okay, so, yes, I mean, I don't know what to do about that one. But the other thought we had about compounds and stuff is that the reason there's a G next to this one is that there are ways in the design guidelines space to discourage people from thinking they can make a large multi-lot statement. So we raised two issues last time. One was, what if people take a big lot and make lots of small houses that are specky, and that's scary. And then we had the opposite concern as well. What if somebody takes a bunch of small houses that are cute and wonderful and then makes some big statement across an entire block or half a block or so? And that part is probably addressable at the guideline level. So we don't have language in there now for that, but we could test some language for the next round that basically says, you don't get to change the rules about following the design guidelines just because you own multiple lots. So that's something that we don't address yet.
But I don't think we have to say that, because the rules for property lines and setbacks and so are for each individual lot. So if there are no more lot mergers, it's automatically baked in. I don't think we have to address that separately, because each lot will have to keep its lot coverage, its property line. So you can only build a house on each lot. And if you build one for yourself and one for your children and you have a walk in between, that's perfectly fine, right? So. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and have maybe one big house and a small house, and that might actually be nice for the street if not each lot is maximized, And actually, when somebody owns multiple lots, they would be much more likely not to maximize each lot. So, if they're using it as a family compound, so.
So that's a good, we're hanging our hopes on the change of the regulation. So, I think you're right that if it does change, maybe we don't need to work on it from a guideline. So maybe we just have to figure out the timing of that.
Excuse me, this is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy. Go ahead, please.
Hopefully this doesn't take you off rail. If it does, go ahead and shelve it. But from the RENA-related processes and the housing element, part of what they care about a whole lot is not decreasing housing unit count. And I don't know how that's reinforced. Maybe Brandon can offer a comment if it fits. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy, for bringing that up. You want to respond?
I think what Nancy's alluding to is one of the main reasons we want to remove that incentive for merging lots, is because every time you merge two lots together, you've taken the possibility of building two houses and turned it into building one house. Yeah. So removing that language from our code is going to be supported, at the state level. It's something we can put in our housing element update saying, look, this is a step we're taking to make us a more viable housing producing city. So it seems like for me, it seems like an obvious win in many facets, from the design perspective and also from the housing production perspective.
What about the scheduling of that? What about the scheduling of that maneuver? When do you see that coming, Brandon?
It's either going to be alongside of the zoning code updates that are part of the design traditions, or the housing element update, both of which are, on the housing element update needs to be across the finish line January this year. January next year. So relatively soon. I mean, we're on a similar track now for the design guidelines. So within the next, 8 months or so, I would say.
Okay, thank you for that. Any closing thoughts on this compounding matter? Everybody had their thoughts. I think it's very productive. This is another thing, the next one up that came up, obviously, during our discussions. The possibility of an extent of enclosure setbacks from the property line. Now, this relates to what was read from Carolyn Walker Davis. There's an idea here. We can reject it out of hand. We can consider it, chew it over. We can do a number of things. but we raised the issue of whether certain types of enclosures, as they get more opaque, might be asked to be farther back from the street. So remember, the general principle is the continuity of the forest, the porosity, as we said earlier, of any built structure. So we've already set it up so we encourage openness in the residential guideline. Then we say, if you need some structure there, how about some shrubs? Try that first. Then we say, if you still aren't, go to an open fence. So we're doing a sort of gradual sort of escalation of enclosure. The question here is really building on that if we want to. It's an option where we say, as you get more closed, less porous, maybe you don't hold the line right at that property line. You let the forest go further back into lot. If you're very interested in having something opaque or taller, come back from the property line. That was just something that was raised. It's a new idea, so we need to, obviously take some time on it and see if we want to bag it, explore it, whatever. Here's Don.
I'm a little hazy on what kind of enclosures we're talking about. I can't visualize that. What are we talking about?
This is just the same kind of fences and wall discussion, but as we've tried to clarify in this new version, we are making clear that the values of the town is toward openness and continuity of the forest. What do you need, Marianne? Those got passed around. Oh, Don still has it.
So this isn't enclosures in the sense of structure. This is an enclosure in the sense of like when you're enclosing the property.
So, for example, I was at I was snooping at a house that's for sale on Taurus, the very big house, and it has a tall adobe wall around a very formal fountain and courtyard. You cannot see that wall from the street. It's integrated into the house. So it's a very opaque, private structure, but it's very far from, so the forest looks continuous through the property. But this, what we still have now is basically no matter what kind of fence or wall or enclosure you put, it is permitted to be right on that public-private line. Do we want to have or test the idea of, well, if you have an open type of fence or hedge, then yes, go ahead and put it on the front property line. But if you start to want something more tall or more opaque, then we would like you to bring it closer to the house. Maybe it's a courtyard that's close to the front door. Maybe it's something that encloses a private garden for one room, this kind of thing. It's just an idea that came up during the larger discussion that is part of that gradation from the street to the home. Do we want to consider it? Do we want to consider saying, if you're going to do a super solid or above a certain height, then please bring it back X number of feet or closer to the building or whatever. This is just really more of the same discussion about the continuity of the forest. Maybe people feel that's too imposing. Maybe they feel it's great. I don't know. That just came up, so I have it on the list.
So for context, we currently regulate height at the front. So it's a 4-foot fence at the front line until you get 15 feet back, and then you can have a taller fence. So that is currently, we have nothing in our code right now other than what it says to starting with no fence, moving to open fence. So we do talk about that in the current guidelines. But we don't have anything in there right now that talks about as your fence or whatever you're using to enclose the site gets less opaque, then it has to move back onto the site. So I think that's what you're saying, like, or more opaque, thank you. Yeah.
Right, it's just another tool. Neil, go ahead, tell us your thoughts.
I'm intrigued by this, a little concerned about the complexity of enforcing it, but you know what, I like it because it gives precedence to the forest. And that is really important to us. So I understand it may be a little bit of a complicated thing, but I like that. I like that, when you see a property and all of a sudden you've got these really visible things forward on the site, and it also diminishes the view of the house as well. So you're also letting the house be the dominant. I kind of like it. I just don't know how we could legislate it.
So there's a check in the pro column If it seems too complex, that may or may not be complex. I don't know. We haven't really gotten into it yet. This is more just we're conceptually testing it. Is it worth getting into? Is it worth talking about? And it's kind of what Brandon says is already there, but maybe more of this. In other words, you get some more height if you're further from the road. That's already part of the regulations. Go ahead, Carol.
I'm thinking of some of the houses that exist presently that have courtyards and so forth, especially the Spanish style, that work well. Maybe we could word it in a way, consideration for more opaque or taller walls, period.
This is Nancy again.
Yes,
I don't
Nancy,
know
go ahead.
if we want to throw this into the mix or not, but the homes that align major thoroughfares, should they be allowed more consideration for sound barriers in whatever form? I don't know that I'm a proponent of it, but I just wanted to throw that out.
I'm glad you brought that up. I have thought about that many times. It's crossed my mind. I've never brought it up in this forum, but it just personally, when you're driving down Carpenter and you see, we've made it very clear that we're not too keen here on estate gates or anything like that, but certainly there could be moments in town that really are special conditions. If you're on a main drag and there's a lot of traffic or stop signs or something, or a bus route, then maybe we have to think about that. I do think it's worth raising. Thank you, Nancy. Go ahead. I see a comment from Melanie.
I would be concerned. I mean, I understand the noise factor and all of that, but do we want things to start looking walled off on our major thoroughfares? I mean, on Carpenter, there's there are very few houses except in certain blocks that have very high fences. And, it's not pleasing at all to go by them. And I think that we still have to be sensitive, especially because we travel those routes all the time. So, it creates a visual barrier. It sends a message to visitors, to all of us that, we can't see any house. We can't barely sometimes see a roof. And just kind of when you're driving Carpenter or Junipero or San Carlos, think about that now and see what you really want to do. Because like on San Antonio, there are certain parts of San Antonio that really appear walled off. I mean, that's one thing that really irritates me when I really don't like San Antonio to drive on, because I really don't like what's being allowed has been allowed in the past. It's very, very walled off in some areas. And it's not a welcoming, it's not a pleasing. You don't see all the vegetation. You just get an idea, well, these people are rich, and so they just don't want to be, bothered by anybody who's on the street. They just don't want to relate to the street. So I don't know. I throw that out just for thought, because I'm really opposed to high fences and walling off of the community.
I like this is like the Socratic method, back and forth. Go ahead.
I think currently we have the 15-foot setback for the house, right, for a structure. So normally if there wouldn't be any fence at all, you have the wall, basically the wall at 15 feet. If right now we could have a 4-foot fence at the property line or a wall at the property line, then maybe rather than having the wall, the house wall at 15 feet, if you give somebody a 10-foot area that they could have walled in front of as an entry courtyard or in front of a room, because you're right on a busy street. And I think it's not only Carpenter, it's also scenic in San Antonio. I mean, there are just so many people, and they always have cars parked right outside their window, basically, sometimes big ones. If you do that with a setback of like 5 feet, for example, it would give the inhabitants of these houses some privacy, and the 5 feet would allow for really nice planting. So then when you go up and down a street, you don't have that walled off right at the street level, but you would have the landscape ordinance would then take care of planting. And it's actually maybe even nicer because you then have control over planting that's almost part of the public space. So, and the people who live there also get what they want, so that might be a good compromise.
Excellent.
Hi, this is Stephen online.
Go ahead, Stephen.
So a couple of thoughts. One is, I think, I'm just building on Marianne's comments. You could simply have a guiding line from the 4-foot to the 15-foot line, so basically a diagonal line, and then if the property owner, or the design sits within that diagonal line, that would be sort of a mechanical way to do it. And then I also think that, a lot of these conversations that we've been having, it feels like it goes back to this concept that there's a set of pre-approved concepts, like a 4-foot property line fence with a lot of porosity. And then if you want to go into this diagonal line, it becomes a review process. So it's not by right, but it has to be reviewed. And then there's a built-in incentive to, stick to the concept. But if you feel really strongly that you want to do this, then it goes to staff for review. That, I don't know if that becomes too complicated for staff, but it's just a built-in way to say to people that we're open to creative ideas, but it has to be within this rule. And you have to go through this process, which is a complication that some people may not want to do.
Well, I thank you for that. I personally like the idea of having, in a way, a preferred or pre-approved. Brandon doesn't like that word, but preferred. Kind of, you're probably going to do very well if you just do this minimal. But if you want to, I like the idea of increasing review for things that are exceptions. I want to make clear that, and at least my understanding of what we're discussing, is that some of the stuff we have now in town would not be permitted under this diagonal, for example. I like the idea of the diagonal, so it's very graphic. But so, and that's not meant to say that people need to tear anything down, or that if it's historic or beautiful or ancient or lovely that it needs to be dealt with. But it would mean that it's in addition to the idea that we prefer 0 things on the lot line. And then we go to plantings. And then we go to fences. And then as you add I like that style, as you add the opacity, you need to go back. So some walls that are there now would not be, because they're on the property line and they are opaque, that would no longer be a possibility. So I'm looking around to make sure that people understand what I think we're discussing. And that seems like okay. People like that. Yeah, okay. Okay. All right, this is interesting. Okay, this is this is new terrain we get to sometimes. Okay, so we're...
In this scenario then, in this scenario, just make sure I understand, a 4-foot wall, solid wall, at the front property line would not be allowed?
Right.
Okay. Is that, because because the whole gate.
But he's grandfathered.
Okay. I know. Well, that's why I'm looking over here, because I saw David shaking his head yes, but we had the conversation about fences and gates and walls, and I thought that we were. Yeah. It's okay. Like, minds can change. I just want to make sure everyone understands. But in this scenario, a 4-foot wall, solid wall along the front property line would not be allowed.
You can imagine, like, let me see if I can.
But that means no more solid walls.
No, they're further back. They're farther back on the lot.
On the property.
So I'm going to draw my diagonal. Hold on. You want a question?
We have a very narrow lot line on our property, for example, and we're on the corner. And so the way that they did it on the front side, actually where the front door is on 12th, there's, maybe 10-foot setback or something like that total. And I think right on the property line is a low wall. And so in that scenario that you were talking about, even the low wall or fence would not be allowed on the property line.
I think it all hangs on that idea of the diagonal. In other words, I think that's the right, easy way to think of it. I don't think there's anything complicated about that way of handling it. But you could start the diagonal up 2 feet. You could start the diagonal back 2 feet. It's possible that wherever that diagonal lands, yes, even a small curb might have to be back a foot, for example, from the property line. It's a sort of disincentive program, very much like we've tried to rephrase this to emphasize, please start with the idea of pine needles or whatever it is, or open dirt, then go to more and more opaque things. So yes, it would mean, but it could end up including exactly your wall. It just depends how you draw that line. The question is, do we want to even try to draw that line? And it looks like we want to try. It looks like we want to propose that and see what it looks like. And then we can talk about, oh, that's too strict, let's raise the diagonal up a foot or whatever. So it's a geometry issue, really.
How are we going to write this out? I'm trying to write this thing out, what we're saying. And
well, it is actually maximum building envelope. That's what it is, except for front yard structures. So I think we actually have a tool that is coming to us that could be, that could incorporate this other type of structure that's not just the building. Neil.
Good point. The planar, we're talking about building envelopes, and we use volumetrics now. And the other alternative is the planar metric system, which I prefer personally. But that begins to work very well now with this. It's in that same language. We're defining planes on the site. So again, it's a plus.
How do I describe it to somebody? Or how do I put it in, is it like a diagonal from the street?
From the property line.
From the, from the.
It hasn't landed anywhere yet.
Yeah, we don't know yet.
From wherever it is, you're looking up at a 45-degree angle.
Yeah, we have to figure out the angle, we have to figure out where it starts, we have to determine where it gets more opaque and stuff. So it's a diagram like the bulk plane, or we're calling it maximum building envelope. Yeah. We're basically saying, this is the thing we're entertaining, that we apply we're calling it maximum building envelope, but it's also the same as bulk plane. We're applying that diagrammatic approach to structures in the front yard also. That's what we're introducing as a concept. Now we may decide we may try it and it doesn't work. It's just like too cumbersome, or we hate it, and then we abandon it. But this is what we're saying, is this is why it's on the list. Should we entertain it? And the answer seems to be yes, we should entertain it. Okay, so good. I don't think we can get much my personal opinion is we can't get much farther around the table about that right now, but Doug, go ahead.
Who's going to draft some language?
That's a good question. I think we could throw it back to this, can we throw it back to this maximum building envelope, which we had tabled?
In the front, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's any suggestions though, because the nuance is, at the property line, does the bottom of the triangle start at 4 feet? So that a 4-foot solid wall would be allowed, or does it start at 2 feet? So you can have 2 feet of solid wall, and then 2 feet on top of that has to be open. Like, that's the conversation that needs to be had. So we can propose something, but if there's any thoughts on that, that's really like a key part of this, is where does the point of that triangle start? Start at grade? Does it start 1, 2, 3, 4 feet up? Because it can't be any higher than 4 feet, because nothing taller than 4 feet is allowed at the property line. So that's the max. But do we want it to start at the ground? So you have to, like, if you want something solid things have to be, set back. Yeah. So any guidance on that or thoughts on that would be appreciated.
I think it's possible that as a first stab, you might want to put the point of the diagonal on the ground as a first stab. It doesn't mean that we can't then have the discussion to raise it up a little bit, but that tests the principle of opacity back from the line. So that's just a thought, but I don't really care.
Yeah, I don't know that makes sense, because that would mean you'd have to be 4 foot in before you have a 4-foot wall again, which you currently can have on the property line. So my suggestion would be to either started at 4 feet, but say if it's at 4 feet of the property line, it cannot be solid. It has to be open, but you start that point at 4 feet where it is currently, so there's no changes to the current plan. But if you want to have a solid wall, then you have to go back, so many feet from there, because I think the other one is really very restrictive.
Again, I'm not sure it matters that much where we start. We just have to start.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a really good idea. In our scenario, the wall is low, which is actually kind of nice because the street comes really close to the house, and it looks good. It's nice. So if you can keep it a couple feet, at the property line, I think that's generally nice. And there's a lot of old homes in Carmel that have low walls at the property line, and they look really charming, and people like them.
Okay, so good luck with that, Brandon. Okay, so we're moving up one tick to the existing and new single-family downtown versus mixed use. That's not a very felicitous phrase, but we have a pin in that because this is something I noticed when I was a planning commissioner, that folks were actually fairly caught off guard when we learned, and it's not, obviously there's original to the town single-family buildings that are in the commercial district. There's a smattering of them around. Most of them are more modest than what we build now, so they sort of have an R1 flavor to them. But what we've learned from the example that Mary Ann brought up earlier today about Unipro and 8th is that because of commercial zoning, somebody who would like to have a very large home, much bigger than you can build in the R1 district, can build lot line to lot line if they buy a commercial lot for their single family home. This is an incentive program, you could argue, as we move into a more, wealth sort of division in this country, to actually remove commercial property from our downtown and make it residential in effect. This is something for me that just bothers me because, first of all, I don't think that was the intent of the founders who envisioned a mixed-use downtown that served the residents. I think it's a struggle to serve the residents, and if we incentivize the replacement of the service to the residents, we are undermining ourselves. I also think from an aesthetic standpoint, it's horrific, but it is currently allowed. And so this is not a guideline matter, but because it relates to design and what we look at and and the use and how it serves us, it is worth, I think, weighing in on whether we have an opinion about retaining or encouraging the mixed-use character of the downtown. David.
Thank you. I agree. I think it's very jarring to have, a lot of commercial and then all of a sudden a house in the middle. And I don't think it's very nice for the people a lot of people don't want to buy a house in that scenario. But the idea of doing the mixed use is really great. So if we steer it towards the mixed use, then we get the more housing elements achieved as well.
Sure. Just the regulatory aspects and everything.
What about it?
I'm trying to ask Brandon if he could speak to us about where this is handled in the code and how it can be reformed if that's the will of the citizens, so that there is not so that if somebody wants a single family building, they go to the R1 district, basically.
Yeah, and I apologize. At our last meeting, I was all loaded up with this information because it's very difficult to do. It is possible to have a single-family residence in the commercial district, but it is difficult to do. But basically, it would be in the, I think it's 1714, where it talks about the uses allowed in the commercial districts. And so we really would just be closing that down and saying, no, any residence has to have a commercial component on the first floor or something like that. So it'd be pretty simple language. And I think I do agree that based on all of the other languages in our code, like we talk about, second stories not being allowed for commercial use, and if you can't take away a commercial use and put back a residential use, things like that. So I think the intent is smattered all over the code, that this was the intent, was to not allow for a house to be built in the commercial district. So I don't think it'd be very difficult to do, to plug that hole. I mean, it's not something we really see often. Again, this is a 1 to 5% problem, but we can, if it's a hole we want to plug, we can certainly do it.
I'm scarred for life because I saw this 1% when I was on the Planning Commission, and it was very traumatizing for the community to go through the fight on the back-to-back properties that are across from the dance studio and the Scout House between Mission and San Carlos. Those were intended originally to be single-family McMansions, and the struggle on the Planning Commission was to get them to at least have a convertible lower unit that somebody could someday use for professional purposes, which will never happen because of the way the buildings are designed. But the regulations would not allow us to get those buildings to be mixed use. So it seems to me that if we can take care of that, I don't know, does anyone have any ideas whether this is at all? I have a C here that it's mostly a code issue, but is there a guideline issue here at all? I mean, you can say it must have the appearance of a commercial, and then let the regulations fill in the use part.
I think that word that I brought up earlier, harmony, I think if we use something like that, that may help us to sort of say, it should be a harmonious environment, so we don't want anything jumping out, jarring, doing something that's odd and weird in this scenario. So I don't want to be racist, though.
Well, harmony is a tough one. I agree. It's a little bit spongy, but and we have tried to be more concrete in the guidelines. So it's a tough thing to capture, I think. But I just occurred to me one quick comment. In the commercial guidelines, we do already have a language about openness of the bottom floor versus fewer openings on the upper floor. Remember that language? It's possible that we could actually add a little bit to that so that it is clear that the use, or that you're after a commercial look, which is what it says basically. It says, we want to, it's basically describing now, has always described a sort of open fenestration on the bottom. The two buildings I'm talking about that are back to back have residential scaled bottom floors. They have small openings. Some, I think, have almost no openings. I think the stone one has like just garage door and a front door that's solid. If you had a guideline, we do have a guideline commercially that basically says we need these bottom floors to be open. That, I've come to think of it, maybe that wasn't there when we were reviewing it, but that could be a way to help, because if you don't have the ability to have a bedroom on the bottom floor, then maybe you give up. Go ahead. Were you going to say something about that?
I'm sorry, to visualize exactly where you're talking about. Are you talking about where the onion?
Nap, the hardware store.
Oh, Naps. Okay, I kept thinking you guys were talking about, across the street. I was just trying to get.
Diagonal across from the Scout House, near Nap.
Okay. Yeah. No. I get it now. Absolutely. No. I hear what you're saying.
Let me chime in. So I think the guidelines are great, and that's fine to do. But really, it's about the use. So if we want the bottom floor uses to always be commercial, we just say that in plain language. That's the zoning code part of it, and that's certainly much more enforceable than a design guideline. I think things like the openness and having a commercial appearance at the bottom, if it's forced to be a commercial space, it's probably going to have a commercial appearance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's sort of cart and horse issues. Is there anything else folks want to say about this topic? The mixed-use issue downtown. It seems like we have consensus on that. Oh, you know what I was going to ask is, let me pass it to you, Neil, in a second. But we do, since these items at the top of our list are less guideline-oriented, we should just reserve a moment to talk about how we're going to let our thoughts be known in some kind of more formal way to the council or the staff or both. So maybe a letter on that, on what we decide here. Neil.
Not a big comment here, but I know in the 2016 committee, we created a fictional block and lot. We actually had somebody that thought they could give us this. And we wanted to bring back the idea of the artist is working in the space where they're showing their art. And so where the artist would be on top and their studio would be down below, that this regenerates that idea of the live-at-home artist. Not that we can ever have that again, but...
I'd like to have the look and feel of it anyway. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't want to lay out my whole thought process here, but just because you mentioned we have consensus, so I do have a different opinion about. I do think, I think that downtown living should be encouraged. I think we have plenty of commercial spaces, not that they should be taken away. And I also think that there are historic properties in town, and if it is the best, if there is only a private owner that can save that building, I would far prefer that than get the building, not be on the register or not, be kept as a historic building as it is. So I
sure what you're saying, Marion. Could you clarify? Are you saying that you're afraid historic properties might be torn down?
No, I don't think that that's possible. But I think if they are empty forever because there's no commercial, it's commercially not viable, but it would be viable as a residence, then I think that is still preferred than it's being empty or getting dilapidated. Or we have a few of those that are in town empty forever, where if you might be able to do a home there, you could maybe rehab it easier. And, I know that property well, and I don't think it's done very well, the one next to NAP that you were talking about, but the basic notion that it is residential in between these other commercial, I think is a nice mixture of things, and I am not bothered by that personally. So,
I actually agree with you on that. I think in our future, we don't know economically what's going to be happening. And rather than have a lot of empty spaces where there would have been commercial properties, I think it would be better to have somebody living in there than an empty space. And I think that may be happening in our future with Amazon and who knows what else is coming down the line. So I'd like to keep it a little more open to the possibility of all residential.
So now I'm starting to think this is entirely, if we're mixed on it, it would be entirely a guideline issue, you could argue, where Neil's vision of the older, live space just needs to, we have to maintain what we tried to do with those projects that are so fortress-like. We would have to require that the guidelines show the possibility of a commercial treatment on the bottom, so that there's a studio option or a professional option or this gets talked about a lot in housing. Housing is the better economic engine for many neighborhoods than commercial. And it has a formula that in America has become a sure thing for lots of places. But there is a movement also afoot to make sure that if you want to preserve the option of commercial or mixed use, that you require this formatting of the building. This is designed to be flexible. So basically you say, you can of course live on the bottom if you like, but it has to appear to be a storefront.
Thank you. It occurred to me, I agree. It occurred to me maybe we could like for the core downtown area, if there's such a thing, that we have the requirement that the downstairs be commercial. But in some of the outlying areas where it becomes more difficult for commercial properties to survive, that we would then make it more possible that people could use that for residential.
So the difference between CC and SC.
What's that?
Central commercial, service commercial, and residential.
Yeah.
That divide.
Yeah.
That's it.
They get less intense if you go out. Central commercial is the red strip down the middle when you see our zoning map.
Okay, so now I'm kind of persuaded that this is actually a guideline issue, perhaps first. So that's enlightening. Okay, let's move up to the next one, which is where and how to handle views, if at all. So this is something Doug raised somewhat recently and has been researching. I don't know, Doug, if you're prepared to say anything about it. Okay.
So this came up when we were reviewing the residential, and there were several references to views. A little history back from colonial times. Views have not been an allowed item except for civil matters. There's been no regulatory responsibility or statutory rule. That changed in the mid-'80s in San Diego when a project that had been approved at the bottom of the hill had a 5-story cap as to its size. And they planted eucalyptus and palm trees, which grew up and blocked the view of the development up on the hill, the Pacifica homeowners. Pacifica sued, and they prevailed because the court said there was no statutory or city ordinance that prohibited the blocking of views as being a right of the upside people. That's caused a rush of cities based on homeowners and homeowner associations wanting ordinances. Up and down the coast, Laguna Beach, Oceanside, Tiburon, Rancho Palos Verdes, all adopted ordinances to preserve views or to set up regulations to allow property owners to preserve their views. The next case was in the mid-'90s in Tiburon, where somebody had a view of the Golden Gate and of the bay, and his neighbor wouldn't trim his trees. The city had adopted an ordinance after the San Diego decision, and that went to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal upheld the right of the property owner that wanted the view. And they cited the 1954 Bourbon case out of the Supreme Court that said the city can be beautiful. There was a case out of Rancho Palos Verdes in the early 2000s, same sort of thing. Someone's view was being blocked, and upside property owner wanted it trimmed. The man refused, went to the Court of Appeal, and the court said the city's ordinance allowed for trimming of trees to allow for views. All the ordinances say you can't build a structure to block a view. You have to leave some opening so there's a view. So it raises the question, do we want to do anything, or do we want to leave it basically a civil matter? Leave it between the two property owners. And if we do, then we ought to go back and look and make sure our language allows that.
Have struggled a lot with this with house designs in Carmel. And I take the policy of going to the neighbors and say, we're going to be designing a new house here. And so here's my phone number. And you would get into arguments like, well, they bought a house that is closer to the water than you did. And so they paid more for that house because it's closer to the water than you are. They should have more view than you because we should all have equal view. So you get into this discussion almost negotiating the views. Well, yeah, you don't want to have your view ruined, but we need to allow this person have a view too. And that's sort of a negotiated working with views I have found is very successful. And then when you go before the Planning Commission, all that business is done, you know. But I don't know if you can codify that, Doug, or if it's just something that you get recommended, or.
So currently, it is codified in the city. We have codified language about views being protected, and in simple terms, it's basically you're not allowed to take the totality of someone's view away. If it's a certain quality of view, think like whitewater views, things like that. There's discussion in the regulations about not being able to take it all away, and it is subjective, and that's why it goes to the Planning Commission. They look at pictures, they do site tours, they see how much of a view is being taken away, how much existed before. But it is codified right now. We do protect both views and privacy in our existing municipal code.
And Doug, can you imagine, we've done a lot of exercises around this table of like worst case scenarios. Do we have language to prevent a worst case scenario? Is there something, okay, you want to? Right, no, I'm asking Doug, do you have a vision of a worst case scenario legally or procedurally that our current treatment of this issue could lead to? Do you see what I'm asking? Like, what's the worst that could happen given what we have right now?
Brandon, a question for you on the existing. Is that for structures or is that for plants? So someone could build a structure that preserved a view but plant a bunch of trees that blocked the view. Yeah. So that would be a worst case scenario.
And that's actually, if you remember, we've had over the last period of time we've been doing this, we had a local land use attorney, Jason Redderer, who came to one of these meetings and expressed his concern for just that our code currently doesn't regulate views being blocked by landscaping, either prospectively or, if you plant it now, you can see, but it grows and it takes away the future. We have nothing either way. So that was something, it was a suggestion actually by him to include something like that in the zoning code update, that the views also pertain to current or future landscaping. So it's something we can explore if we want to.
Neil, sorry.
We all know designing homes in Carmel. Eventually, the owner of your house says, Neil, could you go to the neighbor in front of us and tell him to trim the top of those trees? We can't quite see the ocean anymore. And so there's this back and forth with all the neighbors in front of you, and there ends up being these discussions. So I don't know how that plugs in, but happens a lot, and it has to do with the trees.
So Doug, you gave us a nice history of the controversy. Do you want to throw out food for thought on addressing some of this, or?
I just leave it to the property owners.
You just, mm-hmm.
Yeah. I called Mark Weiner because I knew Laguna had been to a contentious drafting of the ordinance, and he said he has one planner that spends full time on view issues. So I don't think we want to go that way.
I just want to agree that let's not regulate landscaping. Especially if we say we want to be a village in the forest, and then what of all the trees on public property? And we like tall trees and they grow up, and yeah, I wouldn't want to regulate that.
Melanie agrees.
So Doug, Melanie, and Marianne, are you guys saying also take out the existing regulation about structures? We're just talking about landscaping. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that did come up here in the community meeting. So this is a, I don't know, does anyone, so we've got, Neil is advocating and that the system of talking to neighbors and trying to negotiate and basically having a design sensitivity to overlooking people's private yards and views of whitewater, all that is working. But that the issue that was raised at a meeting a while back that, hey, these trees are a problem too, we're saying we want to stay out of that. Okay.
I actually think it encourages people talking to each other. If it's all codified and regulated and everybody goes straight to the regulators and the lawyers, that it really discourages a dialogue between neighbors. So I think trees are a good thing.
Okay. Is that a hand up again, Neil? This is hand out?
Just a real quick thought. I agree with Marianne on this, that it encourages discussion between the neighbors, and that is so important. I just encourage this among designers. When you're doing a house, bring in the neighbors day one, and you may have disagreements and so on, but you say at the end, we can iron those out in the planning commission, but let's do as much as we can between each other. And then it's just very quick and they're they're the neighbor of the person that you're designing for. You want them to be friends. Now that neighbor's going to say they were reasonable, as opposed to the neighbor saying they just totally ignored us, they didn't care about the sounds or anything, you know, and then they're the enemy.
Okay, I like the neighborliness. We still have some neighbors on the Zoom, but we're dwindling, but we're getting up to the top of this list here. You know, I did find in my notes, before we get totally to the top, because we're doing pretty well on time, I just wanted to, so you don't get the sense that we'll be done when we get to the very top. There were a couple things that should have been on here, like we had a quick discussion on faux building elements. I don't know if anyone remembers that. We've spent a lot of time on faux materials, and we've gotten some headway in that. But we had a brief and starred discussion of fake plastered windows on Sunset Center, fake shutters, fake doors that go nowhere, fake chimneys, you know, that we don't have a paragraph on. So maybe I'll insert that discussion right now. I think that we need to clarify that we're part of authenticity is not just the thing you make something out of, but then what you make out of it. So I think we should take a stab at something about false things that go nowhere, that are just devices, sort of fake devices for scaling. I guess it's consistent with that. We're trying not to do these little meaningless jogs and things, but people do that also with fake elements, like this thing I would love to climb up onto Sunset Center and remove. But any thoughts on that, on fake building elements? Should we take a stab at incorporating that, or am I just seeing nods around? Marianne?
That's a tough one because, you know, we, for example, often use a fake chimney to hide. You know, we're trying to consolidate all these vents that you need in a house. Plumbing vents, dryer vents, vents for your hood, and all these stuff. And rather than having 15 things stick out randomly out of your roof, we often try to consolidate it and have it vent into and out of what looks like a chimney. And I think that that's a better solution than having all these random things sticking out of your roof. And then when it comes to fake shutters and fake windows, there is a long tradition in especially Mediterranean homes to actually have painted. You know, you go to any village in Italy, you know, you will find that everywhere to have either painted coins, cornerstones, you find painted windows on an empty wall. I mean, there is murals essentially, right? So there is, you know, that's always the problem with trying to regulate absolutely everything. You know, you want to consider the things where a fake building element may be actually a good, advantageous.
I agree. It's a difficult thing, like even shutters. If you close the shutters often on a shuttered house, they wouldn't extend the full length of the window to really work. But I wouldn't want to see no shutters on certain styles of houses that works otherwise. I do abhor the fake windows in Sunset. There's no question that was terribly done. So it'd be nice to, I don't know how we can regulate without maybe using judgment at the time, the Planning Commission or DRB or whoever's doing it. I don't know how we'd word it to accept some things and not accept other things.
So I happen to be familiar with, as many architects are, the regulatory language for the now not so new, but it was built in my lifetime, town of Seaside in Florida, the Panhandle. That has a very strict building code that basically, and I don't think it was that difficult for them to phrase it, although I can go take a look, basically talks about functionality. So we've had that conversation already here for the commercial district, I think in particular, about awnings and things like that, balconies, things that need to be, in a way, operational in order to. I would argue that consolidating vents into a chimney vent is the modern interpretation of venting through a chimney. I don't think that is faux. That is not fake. I would argue that murals are not what we're talking about here either. That's painting treatment. It's a grand tradition, I agree. What we're talking about is somebody doing the Sunset Center window. I mean, that is ludicrous.
Yeah, or the shutters,
Right.
just narrow
Right.
into that wide.
Right. Nobody wants to discourage shutters, especially if they're appropriate to the style. But when you have a teeny little line of shutters on either side of an enormous building, you are undermining the authenticity of your style. This is exactly what the Seaside Code addresses.
We should just bring that maybe to the next meeting. We studied it in school too. So that's a very, very good ordinance, and it might be something you could lift from that ordinance there.
All right, so I think it's, if people are agreed in general about the concept of the faux, I don't think it's as hard to regulate. Personally, I don't think it's as hard to regulate. The exceptions that people have brought up, I don't think would apply in the way that we would phrase it. Unless there are other exceptions that people are worried about that we haven't thought of. I think it is possible if people want to try to add that paragraph. I think it's in line with everything else we've said about authenticity and integrity. It's just not quite addressed.
Let me throw something out that I saw the other day. So I saw this the other day, and I'm curious how this would fit in. So you've got a house that's being constructed, new house, new construction, and the rafter tails don't naturally go out of the house underneath the eaves. But what they're doing is they're made out of wood, so they're like crafting nice, like sculpted rafter tails, like you would see a large, thick, 4-inch wide rafter tail coming out of a house, and it would be sculpted to have some. They're manufacturing those, and they're essentially nailing them underneath the eaves, so it looks like the rafter tail comes out. So where would that fall in this?
There was an architect at an earlier meeting, Eric, who advocated for that exact exception. It's a good question. I'm not sure. Again, shutters, we might not be saying, I think this is an analog, we might not be saying the shutter needs to be operational. We might be saying it needs to have the dimensions as if it were operational. This is the same thing we say about stonework. We're not asking you to build a building purely by a mason that's a solid stone wall, but it should look as though it has been built by a stonemason. So it's possible that that's how you get around that the functionality is, it has to have exactly the appearance as if it were functional. That's why the shutter cannot be an inch wide, because it would never be functional. If you decide to hinge it and have it cover the window for storms, that would be smart, but you don't have to. I mean, I think that would be the way around that. And, can you think of any other examples like that?
No,
Yeah, that's the main one. Does that make sense to people as a workaround? I mean, I think that's what we're saying. The
rafter tails aren't functional. The function. Like I get the chimney one. I get the chimney one because that's functional, but I'm just thinking like these applied things. And maybe we say no, but I think the issue there is that with modern construction, like you don't have a 4-inch rafter tail naturally coming out of the way that it's built anymore. I mean, maybe it's like a glue lamb or something like that. It just doesn't come out. So you have to fabricate it to go with the style of the house. Maybe the answer is, sorry, get a big 4-inch wide rafter for everyone, and then you have to sculpt it outside of the house. I don't know, but that's the question, because rafter tails aren't necessarily functional, but they are aesthetic.
They were functional when the buildings were built that way.
Right.
But now we have a tighter envelope is what you're talking about.
Right, yeah.
Let's see what
Yes. that's a problem. I just thought of another example, Tudoresque looking place where the timbers may be very well done, look older, attractive, but aren't really supporting the house. But they're part of that look. That would, we don't want to eliminate those kinds of issues, those kinds of designs. So.
Yeah, I think we're talking about authenticity. And so I think if, something is brought before the Design Review Board or the Planning Commission, and it looks like it's going to be an authentic appearance for the type of home and the materials being used, then I think it'll look good in the neighborhood.
My opinion is that from what I've seen in the thing so far, we already have the concepts touching on other elements of the building, and what we just are missing is, it's like a middle scale. We have the materials have to be authentic or treated as though they appear authentic, and then we have the building in general needs to, and there's that middle scale of the kind of building element, a window, a door, whatever. And I just think that's the only thing that's missing. I think we can probably come up with a phrasing that does not require people to go back to ancient building techniques, as long as you're actually accurately reproducing the appearance of that. I think that's what we've been asking, that the stone cannot look like wallpaper, because that's not how it used to be used. So I think it sounds like we should take a stab at it and
Look authentic.
Yeah. Okay, and then the other one, this is going to feel like we're jumping around, I'm sorry, but again, I think we have time. I had a starred thing that didn't make it to the list, courtyard access and dimensions. This has to go, this is the commercial design guideline for a moment. We thought we didn't have it right, or it wasn't enough, is what I remember. The way that we had addressed courtyard, we have some, I think it was sort of a vaguer type of language, make sure it's not too much opening if it's this kind of courtyard, that kind of passage, but don't make it to be too big or small. So I think we just wanted to talk about, and while other people are reacting, I'm going to try to find the spot. Oh no, here it is. 3.3.0 in commercial, provide outdoor spaces to enrich the interplay between indoor and outdoor activities. Underneath that, for a forecourt, maintain the street wall by limiting the proportion of the opening to 30% or less. We had a question of whether those were the right numbers. In 3.4.2, limit for an interior court, limit the entrance to a minor break in the street wall. Well, that's different than 30%. It's a little bit more less. It's more vague. For the interblock walkway, mixed-use properties are 3 or more lots of 75 feet. The width. Oh wait, this is sorry. Indirectly. Where are we? Gates. Oh no, we wanted to talk about Gates density bonus and zoning code. So there was a lot about this transition between the sidewalk and these interior spaces that we felt was either inconsistent or too strict or not strict enough. So I just wanted to draw our attention to this larger issue here, which we did table. So we talked about the density bonus that is permissible and whether that's being abused. Doug?
Are we leaving this? 3.4.1?
I just have it all starred, 3.4.1 through 3.4.3, those first three, I have starred as being somewhat being treated differently and not consistently and not quite figured out.
Yeah, I had some notes from there. Think about some of the projects that we've seen recently, like Ulrika Plaza, when we're redoing these. Also having a floor, like a minimum for the opening space. How do we treat gates with interblock walkways? Expectation for 24/7 access. So I think this is one of those situations where, correct me if I'm wrong, what the plan is, Victoria and I will sit down after we're done with the deeper discussions and do push through with our copious notes and try to see if we captured everything and then do another review.
Right. But I don't know if anybody wants to, I don't know to what, it's been a while now, how much we did table this, but yes, it needs another thought process, and maybe, Brandon, you're the one with the most experience to sort of see what these issues have been. Obviously, you're the one with the most experience, but to just sort of tell us about what's come up. But does anyone have any kind of final comments, not final, but just to inform a revision of this or a review of these three elements, the forecourt, the interior courtyard, and the intra-block walkway? Anything we should all be paying attention to while we take another stab at this?
Well, on 341, opening of 30% or less, you could get down to nothing.
Yeah, that was my comment.
Yeah. So.
We had that note, we're going to build a floor in.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Okay, David, go ahead. What type of floor?
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to talk about a different topic. Oh, okay. So I saw something that came up with the Ulrika project, or it's changing names now or something anyway, about walkways going over the courtyard areas. And so there was some concern because they could connect the upper units of residential units above the commercial through using the walkways. But I think the Planning Commission didn't like the connections. I'm not sure why, if there's something.
It wasn't that they didn't like the connections. It was a conversation about, because we have regulations about how many square feet a single building can be. So there was a discussion about whether connecting the walkways then made two buildings, which on the ground floor are split, if that then makes those one total building. So it wasn't that they liked or didn't like the walkways.
Does it cause a problem at all for the open spaces, having walkways going over it?
If they're totally enclosed, perhaps, but in that case they weren't totally enclosed. They were just on the edges of the buildings. But like there are walkways that have total enclosure. Like you can think of the one our interblock walkway that goes back like through like the Clint Eastwood building, Hog's Breath. That's totally enclosed. The one that goes back to the Thomas Kincaid art gallery. So it's not unheard of to have enclosed walkways, or at least partially enclosed.
So I'm wondering if, because I think there were like catwalks and crosses going across the open spaces. Does that apply to that as well as it being enclosed or not enclosed?
I guess I don't understand the question at that point. It may have some crossing over the top of it, but I don't think that's an issue. It's not really addressed in any way in the.
Like bridges between the buildings, you know.
Did you say for the courtyard, it's open sky?
Yeah, everything's open, but there's. Everything would be open, but the buildings are connected by little bridges that go over the open spaces. And is that an issue for that? Can they do that, or is that not allowed, is the question? It's allowed.
Yeah, the answer is it's allowed right now.
I think it's possible that you're asking, or just correct me if I'm wrong, are you asking, David, whether it's an aesthetic or a quality of life issue to say that a courtyard has a partial roof, basically? So if it's not, and this is what you were hinting at, Doug, is it a courtyard if it starts to get covered, or is that part no longer really the courtyard because now it's roofed? What is the definition of a courtyard? Does it go to the sky, or does it have some covering?
Well, I think we need to have a definition of a courtyard, because there's a project pending which identifies the courtyard, which identifies the walkways as courtyards. So it's 10 feet in width, which is really the walkway through the complex, but they have it identified as courtyards.
Now you're raising an additional issue, I think, which is, but I mean, what he's saying is, how does it count? In other words, if you are having to have a walkway, an intra-block walkway, as maybe part of a density bonus, and then you're also saying you have a courtyard, but really, the courtyard is the walkway. Are you kind of double counting? Or
So the bonuses for like interblock walkways and courtyards are not, you have to have so many square feet of interblock walkway or so many square feet of courtyard. So there's not a calculation where like you can game a system by double counting like a walkway and a courtyard. It just has to exist, yeah.
total space.
That's right, the interblock walkway has to exist. And that was, if you remember, one of the previous conversations with the Planning Commission about the Ulrika Plaza project is the conversation centered around, is it a true interblock walkway because of where it connects, where it comes in and goes out? It wasn't about how much open space there is or whether there was a walkway above it or anything like that there, because that's not what the code gets to for giving the bonuses for having an interblock walkway. It's that it is an interblock walkway. So unless the code changed and said you had to have, X percentage of square feet be open or whatever, that it just wouldn't be relevant right now anyway.
Okay, so we have still two kind of issues here. One, I think Brandon has addressed by saying that really it's just the total square footage, no matter what you call it, that's how the bonus is calculated on the ground. But here's another worst case scenario exercise. Let's say you had a tunnel that connected the blocks, and across, instead of catwalks, you had actually solid building. Now maybe that's possible. I mean, again, and let's not think about Ulrika Plaza because the regulations for that have been looked at many different directions. But let's say somebody's trying to get credit for walking you correctly to good points through the block, but it's entirely not open sky. Tell us about. Okay, go ahead.
What is the courtyard definition?
I'm trying to find it.
Okay, let's look at that because that could solve it.
Yeah. So, but Brandon, that's maybe in a scenario that hasn't come up, but you could totally imagine it coming up. If I get credit for just making subtracting square footage on the ground floor, but I get full square footage above, and then that goes to David's point. To what extent is something that's in between those two things a violation of the intent or not? So if it's a partial covering, there's still pretty good light, but it's still kind of covered. Is that really now getting away from the definition of an open sky?
So I haven't found the definition of a courtyard yet, but I did stumble across like the actual incentive that exists. It says courtyards a floor area bonus of up to 10% may be granted for projects that include a courtyard and or interblock walkway. So either a courtyard or an interblock walkway, and it's a 10% floor area bonus. So I'll keep looking for the courtyard definition, but
I think we're talking about roofs now over a courtyard in a way.
yeah, whether that. Do I need to find the definition? Let's see if that matters.
So the 10% density bonus is for walkways and courtyards. So then it comes to what's the functionality of a courtyard?
So this is in 1714. Courtyard is an open space on private property that is linked to an adjoining sidewalk or walkway in such a manner as to encourage public access. It must be enclosed on at least two sides by buildings and must remain open to the sky. To qualify for floor area bonuses provisions, the minimum width of the courtyard shall be 20 feet and the minimum area shall be 400 square feet. So there you go.
So it's also,
David.
So just the walkways that cover over, because they could be a lot, that amount of square footage would not be counted for the walkways or the open space because it's covered. I don't know. It could be a lot. It could be more than a walkway. It could be a whole terrace or something.
So maybe while we're speaking of this, we talk about, just so I'm following properly, I think you're talking about upper floor walkways. When you say walkway, intra-block walkways are on the ground floor. Although you could imagine one that goes up and down that's purely for going up a grade or something like that. So when you say walkway, you're saying upper floor, upper story walkways that could impinge on the countability of the lower floor open space. Because they cover. I bet you that has not been considered for this Ulrika thing, by the way. That's my guess.
So again, it's either a courtyard or an interblock walkway. So either one counts for the 10% bonus. An interblock walkway is a publicly accessible ground level pedestrian path providing a connecting route between two or more different streets around a block. Such walkways are often coordinated with courtyards and may involve more than one property ownership to complete. To qualify the floor area bonus provisions, the minimum width of an interblock walkway shall be 4 feet. It has no provisions that it requires open space for the interblock walkway. So an interblock walkway could be a tunnel, it could be completely enclosed, it could be partially enclosed by walkways above. So either way, I mean, to talk about this specific project, it's fine, but yeah.
So I think the question on the table is that okay? Is it okay that the courtyard is required to be open space? They both get you density bonuses.
You don't get 20%, it's one or the other. It's either, the way the code is written, you don't get 10% for a courtyard and 10% for an interblock walkway. Okay.
No, I get it. But you can choose to call your thing an interblock walkway and therefore not have the open sky provision. This is all I'm saying. And I'm so same bonus doesn't, you can mix and match the type of square footage, but if you choose to call it in your project an interblock walkway, then it will not, it can have a ceiling, the things above it can be connected. Is that the intent? I mean, I'm just curious, from a design standpoint, is that the intent of an interblock walkway? David?
I would say that I don't think it is, as far as, what people's opinions are in general, because if we look at, the pit, one of the latest ones, they wanted it to break it up into 4 different structures to make it feel smaller and stuff. I think the intention is to try and make the buildings feel smaller, more human scale, and that they are not just one single big building. So I think that they're wanting things to be, separated and not just like create a tunnel through a building, so that they, get some benefit.
I don't know. I think the interblock walkways, to me, should be open. I mean, I think it's too claustrophobic. It's too. It creates. I don't know. I don't get a warm, friendly feeling. Maybe, if you had like a trellis or something like that, that's different than if it's like a roof. I mean, I have a hard time with that. I just think, it should be like a courtyard. It should be an open, pleasing, pedestrian-friendly type thing. And somehow when I think about a covered walkway, I don't get that feeling. It's because you'll have buildings on either side, and it'll be, I think, just, too claustrophobic.
And again, there could be a distinction, and like this is now getting into a little bit of a regulatory matter, obviously, but there could be a distinction between the type of interblock walkway that's a gimme, it could be anything, it could be a tunnel, it's just a sneaky way around something, and one that qualifies as an official interblock walkway and comes with benefits like density bonuses. So
it's an aesthetic thing too. I mean, it's aesthetic as well as, just. It might even be a safety issue in a way, because when you have like a tunnel effect, people don't think it's warm and inviting for a whole lot of different reasons. So, I suppose there could be a time when it works well, but I just find it unpleasing for Carmel.
it's possible that we haven't had this problem and therefore it's not addressed. We haven't had it very often. Yeah.
Melanie, look at page 5, 3.4.1, the Sue Vicino Court. Okay, it looks like between the two streets, between Lincoln and Dolores, the building spans over the pedestrian walk. Okay. Then on the following page at 351 is the trellis.
Yeah, the trellis is because it's still light.
Okay.
And it's a very, it's a feeling in a village, not an urban setting.
But
Well, that's because of the utility box.
Okay.
Saw it,
Yeah.
but not this one. I was trying to follow your thought process. The Suvecino one.
Yeah, that's open, that's fine.
No. That actually has a covered walkway when you go under. And so I also think that partially covered, actually, I don't know what percentage, but this is very nice when it rains and you can step out somewhere and you have some covered areas. So.
To the two businesses too. The cover goes over the two businesses and also allows for a second story.
But it is a covered interblock walkway.
I don't consider it. If you, this is the concept that I'm talking about. Open, and then the next page open, as opposed to something totally covering the whole thing.
We're talking about a certain percentage, right, that we may or may not want to have open.
Yeah.
We're talking about the
Percentage.
background of that.
Yeah. And the other side of this is what's open.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this does not bother me, that small amount of space that's covered, because it's being utilized as part of the building envelope for the whole.
So I don't want to get us too confused. I think what we're talking about is a couple different things. We're talking about whether this is sort of official definition that gets you bonuses, and that's the interblock walkway sort of regulatory piece. In other words, could a developer start to encroach so much on the lower floor to maximize the upper story that it destroys the aesthetic intent of an intra-block walkway? And therefore we would want to clarify potentially that the part you get to count for an intra-block walkway bonus, density bonus, has to do with maybe its openness to the sky. Or, as Marianne's sort of suggesting, in general, whether it's for the bonus or for aesthetic reasons, maybe we should have some kind of definition, just like we do we're starting to try to develop or refine for the opening to the street, the opening to the sky. How much constitutes the definition of these elements here? If you have an interior courtyard that has awnings or projections all around it, how much of that is the interior courtyard? Only the up part that's in the center. Okay, so we don't have clarity on that for the intra-block walkway, in my opinion, I think is what we're learning. It's what David brought up, is like, how much can you crisscross the top of this thing before it is no longer a courtyard? And how much you can do it 100% and it still is legally defined as an intra-block walkway. Maybe that's not great design for our town. That's not what we think of as an intra-block walkway in general. If this building were to grow, this upper story, all the way over to the street, we probably wouldn't think of it that way anymore as an intra-block walkway, even though it technically is. So that's something to throw in the hopper for the editing. This is exactly what I was looking for. Is there anything else that comes up when people look at these first three things about forecourts, courtyards, intra-block walkways that needs to be addressed? Were you going to say something, Doug? Yes.
I think it raises another issue which we briefly touched on early in our existence, which is the density bonus. I mean, we have on our design guidelines about building forms, materials, and modesty and restraint. And it seems silly that you put in an interblock walkway and you get to build a bigger building.
I was also thinking, it's so nice when a developer will put things like fountains and things like that in there that, are not required. Maybe there could be some benefit, for them if they were to do something like that.
I think, like Sue Vecino, I think that there's a loss of charm sometimes when you have wide walkways and sky above. I think that there are times when it's very charming to have part of it covered at least, and then you come to open sky as a possibility. I don't want to restrict coverings and reduce incentives because somebody may have a covering over part of a walkway. I don't know that this is a problem, but I look at these very open spaces and they don't appear as charming to me.
I was wondering on that note, if, for example, somebody started putting balconies in these walkways and stuff like that, maybe they would just have to make the walkways a little wider so that they could get the numbers that they needed. Would that help? So that they could still have like shades coming out or little balconies in these walkways, inner walkways going between the buildings, but they would have to make them a little bit wider because they had these things, you know, that were protruding into the space. So that part wouldn't count, just the part that has a balcony over it. That part doesn't count, so they need to make it wider to accommodate for that.
I think that would disincentivize people to put up awnings and so forth. I kind of think this works as it is.
Okay, we're playing telephone. I think in general, one of the reasons it's probably not addressed is that it hasn't been too big of a problem. I do think it's a time to pick up some things here that could become problems. Let me summarize. So if we look at 3.4.1, 2, and point 2, point 3, one of them for the forecourt talks about actual percentages for how open the entry into the forecourt has to be. The second one, interior courtyard, does not talk about percentages. Interblock walkways do not have also anything about the amount of covering or what constitutes a walkway in terms of the open sky. The courtyard, we found a definition that clarifies that it's open sky, so that's 100% taken care of, but we don't have any language here about what a minor break is, what is defined as a minor break. I don't even really know how people wrote this to begin with, frankly. When I look at this, I say, who decided and how did they decide that a forecourt has an opening of 30% or less? Is that minor? Is that considered minor? Is that major, 30%? Is a forecourt a more major or minor entry type sequence? Maybe, Brandon, you could tell me your impressions. This is all original, yeah.
I have no idea.
You don't know? We're all perplexed. Okay, so let's take a stab at it. For a forecourt which is directly facing onto the street, so they're talking about basically something that, in fact, is this a forecourt? This brick one that's considered a forecourt? Okay, because it's all open. So it appears to me that what they're trying to say is that, you know what? I don't even know if I understand. It's 30% or less of what?
I have no idea.
I think
that's why I didn't want to comment. Is it of the buildings on the entire block?
Right.
Is it on the parcel? Is it? Yeah. It seems like it would be a lot, but it doesn't say.
it could be the street wall. It could be the proportion of the space.
It's probably
the street wall. Go ahead.
It's probably the lot, because it would be difficult to tell somebody to regulate 30% of property that they don't control. So it would be 30% of the lot that you control on that street side has to be open.
It could also, and that might be the right way to do it, you could imagine also that a forecourt, they're trying to get it to pinch, so that if you have a forecourt that's 20, let's come up with an easy, 21 feet wide, only 7 feet of it could be open. So in other words, it's proportion to the forecourt itself. I don't think that's what they mean, actually. That's how you originally read it. Right. But I believe that the intent is probably about minimizing the amount of building that you dedicate to this opening. So I'm guessing that it means the lot width, and I don't they're not trying to pinch the opening of the forecourt, they're trying to limit the width of the forecourt itself. Yeah, so it's basically, and the hint is maintain the street wall. So, so they're basically talking about not the opening. That's what I think is confusing. They're talking about the forecourt itself, because the forecourt opens almost entirely onto the street, and they just don't want that to be too wide. Do people agree with that? I'm just throwing that out. We're 30% of the lot width. Right. So in order to maintain the street wall, does that make sense as a forecourt, Don?
I don't know, it seems clear to me, 30% of the street wall, that's what it says.
Yeah.
So why are we?
Do we like it? I mean, is that what, because, well, it's clear. Or, so,
I don't know what the street wall is. What is the street wall?
That's the building facade.
So why don't say building facade? What is street wall? Street wall, that's where I thought it meant the enclosure of the courtyard.
Yeah.
That's how I interpreted it
Yeah.
when it said street wall, you know?
right,
I didn't know they meant the building.
right. Yes.
Question for Don. Do you have a rough idea for Carmel Plaza on Ocean, what the forecourt is there between Khakis and the west end of the building?
Grand. 80 feet at least around.
80 feet of the, what?
It probably is about a third. If you think about the khakis facade, then that opening, then Coach and more.
I think it's more,
Tiffany.
it's definitely more, yeah, I think it's more, yeah, yeah,
Compare, if you go all the way
yeah,
block
I
to
think
block.
so,
Mhm.
I think so.
Okay, well, so maybe that was against the rules.
That plaza was against the rules.
But it probably depends on how many lots you have too, as well. I mean, if you have 2 lots, maybe you want a different percentage if you have 3 or 4 lots.
But this is not, if it's over 30%, then it's not maintaining the street wall.
If it's a guideline, doesn't it allow the planning commission discretion?
Yeah, no, of course they have discretion, yeah.
So I think we're
I'm just trying to be clear so that they don't have this debate.
searching a rule without a problem, I think.
The exercise is not necessarily to change the rule, or the guideline, but to just see, is it clear enough that the folks up there don't have to have this conversation that we're having now? They can just decide what they want to do with the street wall.
I think it might be clearer to say facade. And also, I think it would be a good idea to say the minimum amount of opening. I mean, we're just talking one single door, or we want something larger. So it might be an idea.
Here we go. Thank you. Okay, I feel like I'm starting to understand the intent of it a little bit better. I think they're basically saying, if it's a forecourt, don't make it too big, like Don did. Make it no more than a third or 30% of the whole opening. And the forecourt itself is not terribly well understood in the sense is the opening itself, at some point it becomes a courtyard. At some point you pinch the opening to the point where it becomes a courtyard. That is not really clear. But maybe it doesn't matter what we call it, if it's a forecourt or a courtyard. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I honestly, I kind of tend to agree with Dawn. I think we got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then the interior courtyard, limit the entrance to a minor break. Now, I think this goes more to Mary Ann's reading of the interior courtyard, which is that she thought, and I was thinking it could read this way, that we're talking about the proportion of the opening with respect to the interior space. And I think what we're seeing here in interior courtyard, it says it's accessed by a narrower opening at the street, then the courtyard itself. So a minor break in the street wall. So does anyone have any thoughts about codifying that, or at least giving guidance about what minor means? A minor break with inviting views. That's what they want.
I have a suggestion from an implementer. I would suggest not trying to put a number on that. I mean, I think at some point we have to trust that we've written the guidelines with enough direction that the discretionary decision makers, whether it's the DRB or the Planning Commission, they can take a word like minor and they can figure that out for themselves. Okay. That's just from a staff perspective. I think we're going too deep on that.
Okay. We also had, so what we've identified today so far is just that the intra-block walkway may have a regulatory issue, which is that we may be giving bonuses for something that could be a tunnel, and we may not want to do that. And so that might need some addressing in terms of its definitions. Nobody has a vision of an intra-block walkway as a tunnel. Right. So that's a real thing to look at. We also touched on, again, gates and lockability, and I don't know if we ever resolved that. Did people, I felt like, I think I weighed in saying that an intra-block walkway is a gift to the public, right, that you get a bonus for. Right. And so
we close parks at night, though. I mean, we close parks at dusk as well, and those are public lands.
Those are public property.
Yeah.
We're talking about private property.
So I would say a private property has even more right to close their property. I don't see any Yeah, if it's accessible during the day, during normal business hours for people. Like the perfect example is the one that goes back towards the Thomas Kincaid Gallery that closes down. I mean, there's rules about when it has to be open and closed. So I think that's the note I had taken, is that we have rules about it being open to the public during normal business hours, but it doesn't have to be 24/7.
I think there was still some controversy around the table about it. I don't know that, yes, it sounds like that's the accurate description of what we have. What I recall is folks talking about, again, this is like, when we give the density bonus, it's like we're creating a sidewalk for ourselves, for the public. We're becoming a partner. We give a bonus. We're asking for public access between blocks, and we're giving a gift for that, just like a sidewalk. And the sidewalk happens to split the block in particular places to get to someplace important or useful. I don't know how you then, the Kincaid one, I guess that is not a dead end, but yeah. I don't know how we.
Well, I was just wondering, we're talking about security. I think that's the major concern for the property owners. And just like all the other facades of their buildings, they can lock the entrances. So everything can still be secure in each part of the buildings and with the walkway open all the time.
Or an alternate to that might be, between 10 p.m. and 7 p.m. It can be locked if need be. For security reasons. Like if people live upstairs, they may want to have it locked at night in the dark. Yeah.
I really want to advocate for that. I wouldn't feel safe walking into one of those 4-foot walkways at night. And if we encourage upstairs living and there will be access to living areas, I think we are all better served if we are able to lock those at night.
I concur. Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, and then, but how do you handle, business hours is not particularly, we have very limited business hours in town. It's not particularly.
Well, just think about the restaurants. Think about restaurants and that kind of thing, So it closed at 10. Yeah, 10 or 11. Mm-hmm.
And what time does it open? Do we have a rule on that right now? Is this a universal rule of the timing of the gates?
No. Yeah, it's on whatever the permit is.
Okay. Well, personally, I think sunrise. I think it's worth. Folks who've heard me talk for years know that I'm pretty possessive about the public land. I feel like that's my land, it's our land, and we should be in charge of it. So the question is, if we don't have a rule that's about accessibility through these gifts of density bonuses and sidewalks, we're trading a sidewalk for a bigger building, then, and that it's person by person or property by property, that, I'm not sure that makes sense to me, because it is a gift of public, it's a gift of public amenity, of you're allowing something that nobody else is allowed to do, and then we just sort of do piecemeal. I'm not sure I get that.
If you want to put up gates, you don't get the bonus.
Oh, if you want to put up gates, you don't get the bonus. But don't we want to incentivize the walkthroughs? I mean, it's a tough one.
Just another issue to complicate things. The homeless issue, which we don't have a lot of in Carmel, but I know the post office closed in part because of the homeless issue, and if they're open 24/7, it might encourage people to lodge in there. So.
If you want to lock it, don't get the bonus.
Well, but you have a bonus all the time. I mean, who wants to walk there at midnight? Just practically. And does anybody with good intentions want to walk into these interblock walkways at midnight? If we want to serve our residential community in town, who walks there at 1 o'clock in the morning? I think that the residents and the public are still served if they can access that from 7 in the morning till whatever 10 o'clock at night. I think that is a bonus for the public. And to say they can't walk into this 4-foot wide walkway between 10 o'clock at night and 7 in the morning, I don't think that's too restrictive, for an interblock for the bonuses.
So this is whatever is our consensus view. What we've learned from Brandon is that there is no blanket policy on this right now.
Yeah, just double checking. I don't see anything.
So, and we've talked a lot, these first 3 items, we're okay with 1 and 2, but intra-block walkways are a sticking point because we don't think they're defined enough, and that includes this hours issue, because we're talking about a gift of rights to a bonus. And so the public, I think, has a right to determine what the exchange is, not a private negotiation, maybe peaceful, unless, of course, there's a discretionary moment where a planning commissioner or commission says there's something very special about this walkway that merits different rules. I think that's okay. That's what they're there for. But we don't have a rule to push against or to analyze for a project at this point about those definitions.
I think as a resident, I do feel restricted not being able to go to the beach at night. That's a wide open space where I don't think there's major security issues compared to an interblock walkway that's 4 feet wide and 75 feet long. So there's a precedent for regulating public spaces and closing it down at a certain hour. I actually don't think why the interblock walkway should be, exempt from that.
And I disagree, because you're getting an embellishment from the city to add on the number of units you're putting, or the number of square footage you're putting in that development.
But isn't that something we want to encourage?
No, I don't want to encourage taller buildings or larger buildings in town.
Yeah, but
diminutive buildings.
But we just got a mandate to put that much more housing into downtown. How are we going to get that if we don't incentivize developers to do so, and give the public a walkway? So I think that's a good, we need to have as many incentives, I think, as we can think of to have developers at these high property costs and high building costs to come into town and create housing.
I mean, the whole issue of locked and unlocked, I just asked the question, why the heck do we need a gate?
I wouldn't feel safe.
Go down there, excuse me.
Yeah, well, yeah, just avoid it then. I don't know. I mean, if it's an interblock walkway, just have no gates. Or if you think a gate is particularly important, leave it open and just try it and see what happens. I mean, we don't have a huge crime problem here. Not to say that something couldn't happen, you know, we don't want to encourage it, but what?
Brandon says we do have a huge crime problem.
Well, I didn't say huge crime problem. Please don't put those words in my mouth. But
She said yes. He said we have a huge crime, and she said yes, we do.
no. What I was saying is I don't think that a city like Carmel-by-the-Sea, even though it feels pristine, like all you have to do is read the police log. We do have serious crimes here. We have violent crimes. We have drug-related crimes. So I think, I'm not saying that we're downtown Stockton or anything by any means, but crime's a real thing. So I think some of the concerns being brought up about walking in a dark alleyway in the middle of the night are well-founded. Just, all you have to do is read the police logs, I guess is what I'm saying. I did not say we have a major crime problem, though.
All right. I'm glad you had a chance to clarify. Yeah, so it sounds like we're really divided on this, actually, just the gating issue. Everything else, it seems like, first of all, if we were to gate, folks, I think, agree that should be a municipal decision. In other words, it should be a general policy. Gates are open. Maybe they're closed for a very short period of time. I don't know. But that it's not a piecemeal negotiation if there are gates, that the public has a right to determine what goes on because the public has gifted extra square footage.
Is there an element in this decision to encourage walkways to provide access in case of fire, for example, or ambulances? Is that part of the argument or not? Because if that's part of the argument for encouraging walkways, then they should be open, right? Because you have to have access 24/7 for fire and ambulances.
Yeah, and that speaks to residential units in there too. Anyway.
So the short answer is, let's say you have a residential building that has a locked gate on the front. Anytime you have a gate, there has to be a thing called a Knox box or a similar type of device that fire and first responders all have an access to. So it would be a similar situation. So the consideration for the interblock walkways is not a egress issue. The reason the interblock walkways are encouraged in our general plan and our zoning code and design guidelines is that they create a sense of exploration in the downtown area. That's what it talks about. But it's not a safety issue, but that can easily be mitigated because those things are required by building and fire code.
I think just I can see where Brandon lands. I can see where Marianne lands. I think the people are fluctuating back and forth. I'm just going to, because I'm a citizen too, I'm just going to say that I'm not afraid of the interblock walkways at night. I like to walk around at night and a day every time. I like the freedom of that. I'm Swiss by heritage. We walk all over the place. Everything's open. I know this is America, it's different, but I think, if
I come from a town that has a lot of interblocked walkways just like that. They all close down at night. So it is a long tradition in downtown, European downtowns, where those covered arcades and walkways, they close down at night. That's just... No, I'm just saying, because in Switzerland and Austria, it's not...
I want to ask Doug, are you saying because they lock at night, their credit should be taken away? Their benefits should be taken away? At night?
Right. The walkways up, you become a partner with the city.
Okay.
You want the city to give you something. You want the city to give you something in exchange for your walkway.
I'm with Marianne.
No, I'm with Doug.
Okay, well, I was not arguing with you, Marianne, about Europe. I'm just saying that that's my heritage is to have free access. It feels like freedom to me. And if I choose not to go a place that I feel is dangerous, I feel like that's my free will choice as an American. So this is just where I land personally. I'm not arguing about what happens in Europe. But I think Brandon's encouraging me to say this is like a toss-up and we might not know what to do here. And I think what it might mean is that we might have to be somewhere in the middle with language where if it is a gated thing, that we get as restrictive as possible about, or as loose as possible about the access, so that the amount of closed time is minimized. Of course, you know, I don't know if we're going to ever find the exact consensus on this one.
Well, and remember, like, the whole process, the way this works is that ultimately whatever the recommendation is that comes out of this committee, and when the Planning Commission makes their recommendations, there's going to be policymakers for the city that make these policy decisions. So this could be one that we just highlight and say, look, we're deadlocked on this one, policy decision makers, pros and cons, you make the decision.
Like most things that we've done during this process, we just reach a consensus, and whatever the majority feels, that's what we should do, but we could highlight, you know, that there was a minority opinion.
I don't know this minority. I really don't know.
No, well, all we have to do is poll the committee and just see how the votes land.
That's a good idea. So we got freedom, freedom, freedom. I'm not sure where you are. Restriction. So it's 3 to 5 right now on the committee.
This brings up a question about the process that I had. So I'm hoping that Brandon and you will all be able to present like a united message at the public hearing or workshop. And so I'm wondering if you're going to take consensus on some of the more difficult issues, so you can say that we've discussed it and we've come up with a consensus, and this is our suggestion. You know, because there's a lot of things that are still kind of quite contentious. So you have made some sort of agreements on stuff, but I just like to know how the process works.
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping we can actually finish the agenda for today, so I'm going to say that. But the process, you know, we've talked about that a few times. We'll definitely be coming forward with a recommendation. I mean, it's going to be the steering committee's recommended draft with all the feedback we've received from the community, which is like the larger steering committee. We haven't really landed on how to do that yet. I mean, but yeah, I think the answer is yes. We'll figure out the best way to sort of communicate to the larger community meeting of what the hot topics were, kind of like we just talked about with the interblock walkways. We highlight that as one where here's the pros and cons. We didn't have a unanimous decision. Here's where we generally landed, but it's up for debate still. Because remember, this document is not the final of anything. There's still a lot more process to go through. There's more members of the public need to get involved. The Planning Commission needs to have input into this, not just deciding on it. They need to actually have input on it too, which is sort of like the next step. Once we get done at this committee level, then we move it along to the Planning Commission, where then this group can participate at that level as well. So it's kind of a long, rambly answer, but yeah, don't worry. There's a lot more conversations to come.
And as for consensus, my sense is that actually there's quite a bit of consensus for, my guess would be like over 95% of what we've talked about. That's my guess, just from being the note taker here. There are going to be moments, and I think Brandon's basically trying to identify that maybe this gate issue is a moment. My understanding of this straw poll for the committee is that the majority is anti-gate. That's Melanie, me, and Doug, and that Don and Marianne agree that there should be some privacy and security at the gates at certain times of day. I'm going to consider that a formal vote, unless, is that accurate? Are we the accurate representation? So I'm going to say that at least for the steering committee, we have a majority view that's pro-gate. I'm not trying to push that. I'm just noting it, pinning it. That's what, at least, we don't know what the whole committee, if it's a very small group today, who knows? But at least we have a position for the steering committee on that. Unfortunately, it's a split view. I wish it were consensual in either way, frankly. Okay, so let's go to the next one, which is, again, we're still in territory where we're giving recommendations to, so now I'm leaving the ones I left off the list and going back to the main list, downsizing and preservation incentives. This has come up multiple times during the year. It's not necessarily anything that we can, at least I don't think we've thought of a way to do this through design. Maybe there is a way. This may be purely regulatory, but a way to just a little quick brainstorming moment to see if there's anything we might, in all our wisdom and experience with all these issues, come up with to recommend that the policymakers to consider to preserve our smaller buildings, to downsize if they're considering large build, if an applicant's considering a large building. What kinds of things do you think would appeal to people?
Well, one thing, I remember when we had a vote citywide on 45% lot coverage, and that might be reintroduced down to 40%. When you look at houses being built on these 4,000 square foot lots, it's hard to believe that it's only 45% of the lot coverage. Apparently it is, but it sure doesn't look like it. So that's one issue, I guess. Another is the level 2 proposal that's coming before the Historic Resources Board, in which we're looking at incentivizing, trying to save some of our smaller cottages, our old smaller cottages, by lessening the restrictions that historic homes have on them, but giving incentives, and it's the council that really has to determine what those incentives are. And really, in the balance of the success of that program is how good those incentives are. If they really, make somebody pause about tearing down a cottage, that's great. But it'll depend on what the council comes up with. But even the concept, if we could include it in the design guidelines of here's this possibility of level 2, might give people pause about tearing down a cottage, for example. So that's another, and then a third idea might be historic district, extending potentially not just into commercial, but also residential areas. And then a fourth might be a charter city, which I know nothing about at this point, but at least that might give us some clout too for doing that kind of thing. So those are the 4 ideas I have.
Nobody has any other ideas? Just Carol? Thank you for bringing your ideas, Carol. Anybody have ideas on the Zoom room out there? So one thing I'll comment on is I think everything you mentioned was not everything, but it's sort of a tweaking of the regulation. So going from 45 to 40, for example, it's just a little different maybe than that is different than an incentive, right? It's a regulatory change to change how big you can build. I think we should talk about that. When I say incentives, or when we talked about incentives in the past, we were talking, I think, more about maybe it has to do with more undergrounding. Maybe it has to do with the speed at which you get your project reviewed. Maybe it has to do with the level of scrutiny of your project. How much of a review process do you have to go through? I think if you're preserving the building itself, you could argue that might be another track. If you're actually preserving your building, even if it's extensive renovations, it's not the same level of scrutiny potentially as a new building. I don't know. So that seems to me more of an incentive. It's like those couple that I just threw out are process-based incentives. You could also pay somebody, like cash. I'm talking about that's a category of incentive, is a process-based incentive. Tax breaks, that's a state issue, I guess. We really don't have any control of that, but that would be more of a cash or financial type of incentive. So I'm happy to, I would be great if people have any incentives that they can think of, and I also want to talk about the sort of regulatory things that Carol brought up. But anything else? This is here because of you, Marianne, this topic. From months ago.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really want to encourage everything underground. So I think the more that can go underground and the deeper it can go underground, the better, and try to not even regulate that too much. I think that trees are an issue, that there should be, I don't know if you can regulate how many tall trees one should be able to grow in a property. But short of that, if you have 60%, a couple feet of soil, you can grow absolutely any bush and anything on top of that. So I don't think landscaping in general is an issue at all. As far as I'm concerned, if you have 1 or 2 tree wells, I think you should go property line to property line and just give lots of bonuses so that you'd have a much smaller house on top.
So say more about that, because now when we underground things, we get a square footage increase.
Yeah, it's the 100 square feet. Yeah, it's way too little. Yeah, it's just not worth that, because the cost of going underground does not match the benefit of what you get up on top. So.
I want to ask Brandon to tell us a little more about the specifics of what we have and the viability of that.
Yeah, I mean, in basic terms, it's you get 100 extra square feet underground, and then it starts counting towards floor area. So you're limited on floor area on a site. You get an extra 100 square feet if you put it underground. That's it. So I think Marianne's point is it doesn't really, the cost of engineering a subterranean space, unless you already, planned on having one, you get an extra 100 square feet, but it's not an incentive to drive someone who wants to have their entire property above ground. It's not enough incentive to drive it down if you only get 100 square feet.
Because it takes 50 already for the stairs to go down.
Right, which counts towards floor area as well. So yeah, it's not a very good incentive.
So what we really want is basically to say to someone that the more they put underground, the less they put above ground, the more they get to put underground, maybe like in a sort of different ratio.
Ideally, it should match. Every square foot you put underground,
But we don't want somebody to.
Square foot you save up top, you can get 2 underground.
Yeah, something like that. So what Marian just said, since she didn't have the mic, is it should be that underground space, you get more underground space than you get above ground space. And that basically, if you take, for example, you take a foot away upstairs and you get 2 feet downstairs. That would be an incentive. What do you think of that, Brandon?
Yeah, it sounds like an incentive. I mean, Marianne knows this, and that's why she made her comment about how much dirt you actually need to plant. But there's going to be a converse argument to this too, that by encouraging people to excavate, that you're then taking away space for the forest and healthy soil and all that. So that has to be balanced as well.
Okay, but we've got an incentive on the table, so that's good. Go ahead.
I just had an idea on that forest thing. So since we have a building setback of 15 feet, it would actually then, if we leave that building front setback and say for the back and sides, the underground wouldn't have to have a setback, you would always have 15 by 40. You can plant a couple really big, high trees in that first 15 feet. That may be enough overall.
So are you saying, Marianne, that the setback, you would permit potentially underground space in rear and side setbacks? That's another incentive, you realize. That's not quite the same, because first one is about quantity. Now you're saying the quality of the thing is you could actually go into the side and rear setbacks. So that is an incentive. I'm writing it down.
So theoretically, if you had a small cottage, for example, and you really want all this for living space, you could go ahead and just lift this thing and move it for temporarily. You can build out the lot fully, and your laundry, your mechanical, your maybe grandkids' playroom, and all this stuff can go downstairs. And then you can put your little cottage back on top, and then you have a functional house, so.
And we would definitely have to work out the forest issues for that, obviously. So I think that is a real incentive. I think this is what we're talking about, what kind of recommendations would be willing to give to the policymakers that have to do with, looking at the regulations and seeing what we can do. The other ones I brought up were schedule-based in a way, and I want to get a read of the room. Do people think it's fair to have another, a middle level of review? If you're if you're a preservationist and you're making even major renovations, you are not, but either you go first or faster, or you go into a different line. So because we have over-the-counter review, we have full review. There could be something in between, for example.
Within the level 2 proposal, I have a whole list of incentives that maybe we could review as suggestions to the council. And one of them is a different fast track, I called it. And so there might be a lot of other incentive ideas that we could use, and I'd be happy to send that to you. Okay.
You want to highlight the incentive part?
Yeah, I cut it down. It's much shorter than it was.
Okay. Oh, okay, good. And then let's talk about the actual regulatory things and this appearance of larger than 45%. And I'm going to ask Brandon again. So one of the things Carol said is that there was talk maybe an earlier time that 45% is looking large, and maybe that number just needs to be, we need to consider whether that's too big of a number.
What do you want me to say about that?
Say what you think about the merits of that and the viability of that.
I mean, if I'm being totally blunt, I don't think that's ever going to get changed. I mean, I think that if it came out that the city of Carmel-by-the-Sea was going to, the price of land and the value of property, if we were going to somehow crank that down 5%, I just don't think that you're going to get that across what it takes to get that sort of regulation passed. It seems unlikely.
I didn't ask this question, but what if you add I didn't ask this question before, but what if you add a Mary Ann provision, which is like we're gonna give with one hand and take with the other. In other words, slightly reduce the above ground, but we're adding, maybe it's 3 times, so whatever it is, something very sweet underground. We sweeten the pot. Does it have any viability, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I don't want to be the person saying whether things are good or bad. I mean, that's a bigger policy call. I don't know if the 45% and going to 5% less is really the issue. I think it's more about the design and the massing and how things are being built on the site. I think that's the perception of things feeling big, is how they're being built and designed, not that they're 45%. I don't know if that's really the issue.
Another consideration in that 40% versus 45 is ADUs. And now we can cover so much of the lot with ADUs. And I don't know what's coming down the pike in terms of our own ordinances in terms of ADUs, but we're talking at 3,000 square feet, I think, that can be covered if somebody sticks an ADU on the lot. So if we looked at something like a formula for if you're building an ADU, the increased square footage of the ADU reduces the square footage of the house you can build, that kind of thing, so that it controls at least some of this incredible lot coverage that we're facing in the future.
Can you speak to that too, Brandon? I'm sorry. Yes, you can. You can. Just about, because you're obviously on top of this, what's required by the state and what we're permitted to do in terms of ADU and how our regulations intersect with that locally.
Yeah, I'm not going to go too far down that road just because I'm not really prepared to talk specifics about ADUs. We are working on our ADU ordinance right now. There is an intersection of where you can start to regulate how much square footage the main dwelling gets versus what's allowed by right at 800 square feet at the state level. So we do have some balancing that we can do on that, and that's part of what we're trying to work on in our ADU ordinance right now. But yeah, I don't want to be that guy, but we've got 20 minutes, and some of this stuff we're getting pretty deep down into codification and deep policy stuff that I think our time might be better served to finish our list, because we got the DRB structure thing I think you guys want to talk about, and then
I think we're gonna make it. Maybe I'm overly optimistic. Go ahead.
Yeah, my biggest concern is, the forest is in very bad shape, and with all the stuff that's coming down, we're getting more and more mass, and less room, and I think that's why the woman who brought it up at our meeting months and months and months ago about the FAR, I think we need to be very careful. We don't want to become a village where we only have street trees. And if we're not careful, there's not going to be room enough on private property for our trees. So I think that always has to be in the forefront of what we're thinking about. Because if we lose the forest, or it no longer appears like it's a real forest, or an attempt at a real forest, and maintaining it, we lose one of the most important signatures of our community. And we land up being like some of the other coastal communities where you see a tree here and you see a tree there, and you know, it's not a forest anymore. And my feeling about, you know, the FAR and so forth, and digging deep, is I just care about what's on top of the ground more than I care about what the heck someone's doing in their basement. And the only thing that would cause me concern is, at least in the area that I live in town, there are quite a number of driveways that are like this, that are totally non-usable for a driveway. They're just retaining walls, and if the people don't live there, they start looking trashy, and they accumulate a lot of garbage. And so if we're allowing people to go underground, we have to be more careful about where we design garages and how everything works. I mean, the trees have to be, I hate to say it, the most important thing to me on the property, keeping the forest alive, and also giving people privacy, because the more density you have on the top, you know, you're going to have more issues of incompatibility with neighbors. I just ask us and ask Brandon to, you know, really think about that and help us with, otherwise the first three principles that our guiding principles that we've developed relate to the forest, and housing being secondary to the forest. So that's my spiel.
That's a good spiel. So I want to point out that for these uppermost items on the list, except for the fake elements that I'd forgotten about, most of this is going to be recommendations to the council in I think a separate, they can't be addressed in the guidelines. So in a separate authored piece, we should lay out some of these things for them to consider. And that brings us to the final thing on the list, which is the DRB structure. I think we've had many conversations about this over the year, and what the type of composition it could be, what role it could play. I think we should just, again, having no authority as a design committee, we still can recommend, because we all have a lot of experience with having sat on the Planning Commission, having been before the Planning Commission, having watched the Planning Commission, what would help in terms of the review of these projects. Who wants to start off? Thoughts? Yes, David. Oh wait, Don was grabbing. I'm giving quiet Don the
The main thing I'm concerned about is the composition of that board, and I think we have to allow the widest net for professionals on that board, meaning not limiting to the city limits.
I spoke with Commissioner LePage after the meeting last night, and I was asking him, because he worked on the commission while they had a design review board. I wanted to get his perspective and how he liked it. He said it took a lot of workload off of them, and so it was very helpful for as far as that is concerned. So I don't think it's going to slow things down too much, although the design review board should probably meet more often. And maybe consider having a member of the design review board meet with the people if they're interested, to discuss things before they come before the board, to give them some guidance and feedback, so they're not just, so they're more prepared. I like the idea of widening the net for people, because I know that it's hard to find people to be on boards and commissions. But I'd like it if they had some connection with Carmel-by-the-Sea. Either they had lived here, which is cool, that they grew up here, that they have a business here, have some sort of prerequisite that means that they care deeply about how the community evolves.
Is that separate from the Planning Commission in addition to it? Okay.
I don't have a preference whether there's a DRB or just a planning commission, but I think that what's key for both bodies is that there's better training for the planning commission and there's good training if there's a new DRB. Because I think very often I listen into discussions that are that shouldn't even be discussions because they are already in our design guideline. There are guidelines, and it sometimes appears as if the planning commissioners may have never read the guidelines or not gotten kind of a training on the guidelines and the code. And I think that would help a lot in reviewing projects if the people who are on these bodies are trained properly to serve there.
Well, that kind of training was more common quite a long time ago than it is today. But if you go to the Planning Commission and you know what the guidelines are, and I speak from experience on this, they will listen to you. But initiating is where the problem is. I mean, when you get the staff report, now it's really nice because the staff goes back to the guidelines, and that's very helpful for the Planning Commission and also for the public. So I think that number one, the idea of some training is absolutely necessary. And number two, I think that they definitely should be separated because the Planning Commission can't do, because there's not enough time, to do a good job of planning, especially long-range planning or even current planning. And so I really think they need to be separated. And the only problem I have with casting a wider net for professionals to be on there is this: they don't get Carmel. And if we have people outside the community, we've got you, we've got Victoria, and we have Marianne, and I'm sure there are a couple of others. We're not going to have a predominance, I don't think, of architects on this anyway. I think we'd have the most, one or two. I think that the DRB needs to have, a wide range of people and professions and people who understand something about this, and not all of them are professional. But I think the training is one of the most important things that we have to do. And I think that's especially true of the Planning Commission, because some of them come on board, and if they don't have a clue as to what's been done in the past, how are they really going to be effective? We're going to get bogged down like we do now, spending way too much time on a project that if you just read this, it would give you plenty of guidance. But if you don't read it, like if someone hasn't read the general plan, if they haven't read the zoning ordinance, if they haven't, read the design guidelines, well, they cannot be a really good functioning planning commissioner. And that'll hold true for the design traditions. So, I think that's important. Then I want to make another plug. It has been suggested to consolidate historic preservation with design review. I don't think, in my personal opinion, it's not going to work. They have, meaning the Historical Resources Board, they have a very important charge. And if their charge is done correctly, they should be plenty busy. And if they're not that busy, well, then the staff doesn't have to do the work. So, you know, I just think their mission is very, very specific and very important for the community, and it needs to be given the fullest attention. And it will not be given the fullest attention if it's conglomerated in with a DRB. We've had a DRB in the past. You know, we know the success of it, and if it wasn't successful, then we have to analyze why it wasn't successful, because it's successful in many, many, many communities for the same reason that we are articulating for our community. And so that's it.
Okay, I'm not sure folks are aware of what important things have come up here. I want to reiterate what people have said a little bit. So we've mentioned professionals. We've talked about whether that they should be included, and that if it means going outside the village, so be it, but hopefully with a village connection. I think we need to be a little more specific there. What are we talking about when we're talking about DRB professionals? I assume, Dawn, that you're talking about architects or people, maybe landscape architects, people who have license and training to evaluate design matters. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think, say you had a 5-member board, I think at least 2 need to be licensed architects.
And what about landscape architects?
Yes.
So are we saying 1 or 2 licensed architects and at least 1 licensed landscape architect, or are the 2 positions able to be either landscape or architects?
These are abilities, they're not hard and fast rules.
Right, but what do we want?
Well, that's a good mix, to have a good landscape architect on there.
I don't know how many licensed landscape architects you have in the city of Carmel. Yeah. I don't know if there's more than 1. Oh, wider net, yeah, but there was a lot of talk about not allowing a wider net. So
let's just entertain wider net.
Yeah.
The ideal ratio for you, Marianne, on the DRB?
Well, ideally you have 2 architects and a landscape architect, and then maybe 3 or 4, citizens, so that the citizens have the majority basically, but that you have good professional representation.
So a larger board than 5.
Yeah, I think that might be a good idea.
Okay, so now we're adding a topic, which is the size of the DRB. I had just defaulted to 5 because everything's 5, but are we saying 7? Oh, thank you, Marion. 7 on the table right now. I feel like it's an auction house. 7 members, 3 design professionals, 2 of which are architects, 1 of which is a landscape, the minimum, and the majority. That's 3, so 4. I don't know if there's any other way to do that, and if people feel that the citizen majority is more important than the professional majority.
I like the idea of 7 because often people are missing, and then you end up with 2 or 3, And I also like the idea of 4 residents being on the board and with the professionals. And I also like the idea of separating it from the Historic Resources Board. Being on the Historic Resources Board, I think we can, even though we aren't terribly busy sometimes, I think we could be more busy. And I'm always throwing agenda items out there. So I like the independence of those 2 as well.
Yeah, I really like the idea of making sure that we have the correct professionals to guide people, but having a majority of the citizens, residents, because then I think when decisions are made, people will feel like they were represented well. So there might be less resentments if things are approved that they don't like. Blame your neighbor.
I'm anxious to hear from Doug.
No comment.
Okay, so the only other thing that and we only have a few minutes here, so now I'm just going to highlight one other thing that was said, which is that David mentioned an early meeting with applicants. That is something that the staff does all the time, always has. But what you're introducing is, because you're saying it's the DRB, that makes it a new idea, in my opinion. The idea being that the applicant might have a resource in the membership. This could actually apply to the Planning Commission also, but that the Planning Commission and the applicants are encouraged to be in touch prior to coming to the formal meeting. Now, of course, that happens anyway. Applicants call planning commissioners and they advocate or ask questions, and that's a free country and they can do that. That is not a Brown Act violation as long as you are not connecting the dots between the planning commissioners. You, as a private citizen, are not subject to the Brown Act. So, unless you're being used to violate the Brown Act. So that happens. What you're encouraging, David, is, and I'm throwing it out there because I don't think it's been done. I want to highlight it, that there's almost like, office hours or something that people can approach and get informal pre-advice. And I think Brandon's very nervous right now.
Well, as an example, last night we were addressing some things, and I said hello to some neighbors that had a project coming up or whatever, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, we can't have black and white houses, and we can't have metal roofs. What are we going to do? Would you come and look at what we're doing and see if you can help us find a solution so that we present something that will pass?" I said, "Sure, I'm happy to help." So I think we have a lot of people who would be happy to help. So I guess that they could come to you and to your staff, of course. Yeah.
So I think I see problems with that, and you definitely felt my nervousness. The reason I see problems with that is because then you're taking one member of a decision-making body who then is spending time with people to give them guidance that may not be the same guidance or what they're going to hear in a hearing body. I think it sets it's a dangerous place to put somebody, both the applicants and the decision makers. So I think that's a staff function, always has been, probably always should be, because we're in the meetings every time with the HRB or the DRB or the PC. We get pretty good at reading the tea leaves. So that's why we meet with people ahead of time and say, I know you really want this black and white house, but you're going to run into a buzzsaw, and they can either take that advice or not. So I would suggest not doing that.
And again, what you were proposing is a formalization of something that actually does happen. We know that. I mean, it is a free country. We have a right to speak. And so people, but right, the question is, should we encourage it or not encourage it, or to stay neutral? And I just wanted to make sure that we discussed that. Melanie?
I think it's totally inappropriate. And
many planning commissioners decline those.
Yes, because and this should be part of their training. They should understand that it gives an appearance of a conflict within the group as well as outside, that most people would be too afraid to do that anyway, and for obvious reasons. But I think that it undermines the staff, for one thing, and I think that it has an appearance that is inappropriate. And it's it doesn't have to be said in law, it's just like in the law. It's the common law, and that relates to the appearance of something that you don't really want to get into that's inappropriate. So I just think the staff's doing the right thing, and I think that it was good of you to bring that up so that we could discuss it, because it does happen, and we don't want to get anybody in trouble, and we don't want to get a conflict between the boards and the staff. It's totally inappropriate.
Okay. I didn't have a strong view, but I think that it's a good topic to check in on, for sure. So now we're about to adjourn. We have future agenda items here. It strikes me that the obvious one is the municipal guidelines. And of course, any other things that we will never tackle in the guidelines probably, that we've mostly been concentrating on today. How does this committee want to, this is a committee matter, address an appeal to the the other regulatory bodies about considering these things that will not be part of our guidelines. So we can do that at another meeting also. That would be my 2 recommendations. If anyone else, any other agenda items, real quick, let me just ask Melanie.
No, not so much that. I just want to remind you to remind the group about additional things that need to be put in the guidelines.
Oh, good point. Just, I think you're saying, just in general, if you are outside of the meeting, and Brandon and I had pledged to sort of take a go at this now and incorporating the notes. If you feel like something has been on your mind and you're not sure we heard it, or you are sure we heard it, just put it in a note, send it in, please. It doesn't picking up red lines, basically.
I have one item, and I'm not sure if it's in scope or not, but it's about utilities in general. And the concern I have is that I see a lot of beautiful houses being remodeled, and then I see an ugly meter, like an electrical meter in the front or a gas meter in the front. And I understand that there's a limited kind of influence on PG&E and American Water, et cetera, where they put their meters. But also there's flexibility. I'm going through that process right now with PG&E, and I realize that there's a way to make things more beautiful. For example, a lot of contractors in the city do not know, according to my information, that you can put multiple utilities in one trench. So I had to go read the blue book from PG&E to figure out how that works. But it is possible to simplify things, to streamline things, to combine boxes and meters to make things disappear, right? And then we can come up with some guidelines how to cover that with vegetation. I think that is something I'll be interested in. I don't know if it's in scope or not.
Will you write that in? So one sec, Carol. We have addressed a lot, but mostly in the commercial area. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves that there's stuff to be done in the residential area. I'm going to note that down in 1 second. But also, please write that in, because we haven't talked about it that much for residential.
And can we revisit number 2, the downsizing and preservation incentives, once we get a fuller list of potential incentives as well? Thank you.
Brandon, a question. Has the contract with Davy for the landscape ordinance been signed? Okay, could I ask that it be held and we have the landscape ordinance on our next agenda? David made a suggestion at the last meeting. Marianne seems bothered by the route we're taking, and maybe we can talk about it.
Well, I kind of need to know what the conversation is. Remember, City Council said they wanted to be the ones to make the decision, and they kind of took it out of the committee, other than like just guidance about what should go in the landscape ordinance. I mean, what do you want the conversation to be about? Where we go from here with respect to like who we choose for the. I don't think that's a committee item.
David had a suggestion. Marianne doesn't like the route we're going on.
So I think those would be comments to be made like when the City Council is considering a contract. I mean, I'm not trying to say flat out no, but I think we got so much other stuff that's within the purview of the committee that we can work on.
When we approached the council in December, this was to be on a parallel track. This was to be on a parallel track with our work. Our work's about petered out, and we have no progress on the landscape ordinance. So I think it's a point of discussion.
Somebody who knows more about trees and the preservation of trees and not just a whacking off. And I don't think that they're appropriate for Carmel. Send them to San Jose. They work up there anyway, I think.
So maybe what I can do is suggest,
Are we dead?
or batteries, but it's only Catherine on there. So what I would do is suggest that maybe the chair and vice chair and I sit down and talk about how to characterize that agenda item, because to be totally honest, it's not the decision of the steering committee of which contractor, whether or not, I know you recognize that, so I don't want to take a bunch of time away from the other work that we need to do here. So maybe we can figure out how best to create that agenda item, because I don't want to spend 2 hours talking about it. It's a waste of time, honestly.
No, but I think it's so central, that issue is so central to our first three, policies and goals for the city, that I think not giving some input, I would love it to be crafted with you three, because you'll know how to do it to best appeal to the council. It's obvious after getting shot down several times by the council that, we don't have a great batting record in relating to them or getting anything understood that we prioritize. So I'm really happy for you to do that and see what you guys come up with. But
let's agendize it that way then. Let's agendize it by assigning it to the three of us, at least for our first pass.
Because I think, Doug, I heard you say like the work's petering out for this group, but I don't think that's true. I mean, we still have a big meeting to talk about, like we're gonna go picture by picture through the guidelines. We're gonna talk about the bulk plane stuff. We got a lot of big stuff still to do. I don't feel like the work's petering out, so I just don't want to get mired in a landscape conversation, because I just don't think that's fruitful at this point.
But we should talk about it, and we'll just at least get up to speed. Go ahead.
Melanie's opinion about the contractor under discussion is
spot on.
heard in the community.
Yeah. Okay, we'll agendize that. Thank you for adjourned for now. Thank you, everybody.
To have a review. Bye-bye, everybody.
I like it. Well, my business is